Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick here with Bruce Fein, and welcome to another Fine Points. Bruce, nice to see you. Um, Bruce, what would you like to talk about today, right before us going live? You mentioned that you'd like to speak about Elon and Doggy, as I
Yeah,
like to refer to it. So, because it's
yeah.
been a dog. Uh, why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts about what
A
might.
couple. I mean, the headlines, of course, are that Elon Musk now is turned against Trump's budget, says it's terrible, which it is. It really is a version of the Biden budget on steroids. Another $2.5 trillion deficit uh, shows that we haven't downsized anything, despite the claim that if you got rid of Cookie Monster on Sesame Street, then the government would shrink. Well, I mean, that really doesn't happen that way. Um, so, it shows that you have naturally attracted to politics sociopaths, and Elon Musk falls into that category. Not the only one. I think most of the members of Congress are also sociopaths. And why we need separation of powers and checks and balances, because these people have ulterior motives. They're not there to try to maximize liberty, which is the glory of the country, trying to maximize their own power and strength and financial wealth. And people have asked me, Jeffrey, well, what's going to be the legacy of Doge? I just think without Musk there, it's going to disappear. All of its legacy is going to be it broke, a lot of uh, plates in the kitchen, and it discouraged anybody good from staying with the government and from becoming recruited by the government. And the ultimate results are largely going to make it more difficult to downsize government, because it will come with this taint of Elon Musk illegally running through and shutting down government offices, refusing to spend money, being a de facto cabinet officer without any consent of the Senate, which was required by court orders. Um, and so it's going to make the downsizing, which is urgent, even more difficult rather than less difficult. So, what's the message overall that we should learn from? There's a legal constitutional way to downsize government. There's in the Empowerment Control Act. You can get legislation by the House and the Senate to curtail spending. There are ways to do this without being cruel to incumbents. It's called transition or grandfather clauses. I remember, Jeffrey, in the Reagan administration, we simply decided we wouldn't hire replacements when persons retired because of age or otherwise. It didn't cause any disruption. We downsized government, but we didn't upset expectations. And that was a decent way to do things. We didn't have difficulty in recruiting good people to come and work for the government. But this idea that you can run government efficiently with witless, brainless people is absurd. You can't. Government is complex. And with separation of powers, the process is important as a result. It requires you to know why you have to go to Congress for certain things. Indeed, right now, I believe, Jeffrey, you can see the schizophrenia in the Trump administration, because today you're getting stories that they actually are asking Congress to rescind money that had been appropriated, NPR, State Department, or otherwise. That's the way you do it. You have rescind it, you have to have a debate in Congress, and then you vote it up or down. At the same time, they're claiming they don't have to go to Congress and just trying to not spend money unilaterally. So it comes back again and again. We need to make the system work through separation of powers. And it means as well that the president, and this happened under Roosevelt, who got 77 statutes in the first 100 days, that's how you have enduring impact on the United States for the good. You get the statutes enacted, the statutes can repeal these government programs. And my judgment, the reason why we're still living in a New Deal era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because he got the statutes. There weren't executive orders. The executive orders, they come and go. Next president, even if they're good executive orders, because I've been at transitions, Jeffrey, every administration comes in and says, how can we separate ourselves from the previous administration? We want to have our own legacy. So they'll even throw good ideas into the trash can if it's not there, right? So you do this by executive order, there's no way those are going to survive the next occupant of the office, which shows that it's very stupid. But to understand the way Washington works, you have to have some brains. You have to have been here a while. And unfortunately, neither Mr. Trump nor Mr. Musk have any clue how Washington works. And they pretended that they did know, and now we're in this huge mess.
Yes, I think the Department for Governmental Efficiency was actually very inefficient and ineffective. So I think that's all that was demonstrated from Musk's experience in Washington, is that he was ineffective and very inefficient.
Yeah.
So
I'll just give one example, Jeffrey.
A lot of noise. That's what he.
Yeah. So this is one example. I'm sure the others. And I told it to you before we started the show. I got a notice from the IRS. It said, make a call. Here it is. You can transfer some credits from one tax year to another. I put in the call. It says, okay, first, your hold time is 45 minutes. Then it was an hour. Then it's an hour and 45 minutes. I gave up. I can't spend the whole day sitting on, and that's more efficient government. And I'm sure I'm just one of probably millions getting the same kind of treatment. That's making government more inefficient, not efficient.
Yeah, I think the problem with all the bluster of Trump and MAGA, I think they continue to want to try and sell the illusion that waste, fraud, and abuse will balance the budget, and the part of it that doesn't succeed in balancing the budget will be by incremental growth, and so that basically it's a free lunch and no hard decisions have to be made, and that continues to be the lie that basically Washington tells, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. I think that there are a few exceptions to that, and those exceptions are the ones that Trump is spending the most time insulting, which in the House is Thomas Massie, and in the Senate it's Rand Paul. They've been very outspoken in the fact that spending needs to get cut, and what are they getting in return? They're getting insults. So we had Musk coming in saying, if we think about what was said from the beginning of this administration, cutting $2 trillion in the budget this year was easy. That's what we were told. Okay, that hasn't proved that easy. So we were told that the war in when Trump got into the White House, there was in place a ceasefire, an agreement that was negotiated with the participation of Trump's team and Biden's team working together, that should have led to a permanent ceasefire. That was like phase 3 of the deal that was agreed to between Hamas and Israel. So instead of having a durable ceasefire, we're back to no ceasefire and active engagement. So you could say that when Trump came in, there was a ceasefire, and there was no longer a ceasefire. And the war between Ukraine and Russia was going to be over, and trade wars were easy to win. Okay, so those were the promises that we were made. So what do we have? We have now Trump whining about Mr. Xi. Now we have Mr. Art of the Deal. Okay, the negotiator of the millennium. Finding Mr. Xi hard to negotiate with. He likes him personally. He loves him personally. Loves hanging out and talking everything except being able to conclude, a successful negotiation. So we have a trade war that clearly is not easy to read, with people that are win and with people that are hard to negotiate with. From the guy who claims he wrote The Art of the Deal and is the master of this on a multi-verse scale that is unmatched, by anybody in any universe, this one or any parallel universes that exist. We were told that how he instilled fear and respect in foreign countries, and we have Iran now enriching more uranium at a faster pace than they ever did. Okay, so Iran doesn't seem to be operating much fear. I don't think that most of the European countries have not succumbed to the fear of the threats of all the tariff regime. Putin has not come to the bargaining table to have any serious conversations about peace in Ukraine, and we have a budget deficit that's going to projected to grow 2.4, 2.5 trillion, during this administration. So we're going to increase the budget deficit. Getting trade deals done are difficult to do. Who knows if we're really offering anything? We might have actually enriched less. Iran might have enriched less uranium if Trump would have stuck to the deal that Obama would have negotiated.
Yeah.
So think of the irony of this, that we would supposedly get to a point where we were going to be tough on Iran and scare the shit out of them. So they went instead. They've accelerated their enrichment of uranium. And again, that might be more than they have enriched if Trump just didn't withdraw from the agreement that Obama had negotiated with it. I'm not going to say that was the perfect deal. The question is, are we better off today having kept to that deal as opposed to not keeping to that deal?
Jeffrey, let me. I think you've set forth a huge agenda, and I think it's a useful platform for this reason, that if you go back and try to understand, the framers and separation of powers and the role of the United States in the universe, as envisioned by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, virtually all of your descriptions would have the framers said, why are we involved in those things? We want invincible self-defense. We don't celebrate anybody's misery, but we cannot. We need to know the limits of what we can do. And there was lots of misery around at the time of the Declaration of Independence. There are all sorts of colonial oppression in Central and Latin America, dictators all over the world, including Asia and Europe. But we didn't try to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, because we knew our greatest power was the power of example. We need to have invincible self-defense. Don't touch us. But other than that, you leave us alone. We leave you alone. You may become dictators in your own sphere. Leave us alone. We can't cure that. Only your own people can really defend the right of self-determination, government by the consent of the governed. And that was true. We actually acted on that principle. The Greeks came to the United States in around 1820, 21, when they were engaged in a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. They said, well, come help us. Come help us escape from the Ottoman Empire. We said, you got to do the same thing that we did. We were fighting 3 million against the whole British Empire. And we told them, you go do what we did. So that's your issue. You have to do it. Same thing in Hungary in 1848, 49. The Russians were invading Hungary at the time of the revolutions in Europe. The Hungarians came here, Louis Kossuth, and said, hey, come help us defeat the Russians. We said, you know what? You need to defeat the Russians if you can. We need to keep our own democracy, our own self-government shining like a beacon to the rest of the world. We don't know how to solve your problem. We have to have that modesty. Not because we encourage other people to live in misery. We know we only make the cure worse than the disease. One recent example, we go into Libya, Gaddafi's a bad guy. Now it's even worse. The most hated figures in Libya now are who? Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. You came and destroyed our country. And aside from the fact of destroying other countries, like we now, in another respect, we brought a worse addition to Taliban after 20 years of wasting $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan we started out with. When we project this power abroad and act like an empire, we destroy our liberties at home. We understand due process goes out the window. You just say, okay, you're illegal immigrant, you're an alien enemy, you're a gone. We don't have any due process. All of our right to privacy, Jeffrey, is gone. We don't even know how much the NSA is spying on us, other than it's huge, gobbles up everything. The right to privacy goes out the window. And we end up with lawlessness because we're trying to run the world. And the world, if you're going to run the world, you need secrecy, you need dispatch, you need just one general. You can't have more than one. The deliberative process goes out the window. So all these things convince the framers we'll never want to be an empire. It'll destroy the reason why we issued the Declaration, to secure unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That was what made this country separate and distinct. Now, until we get back to that understanding, this is just, it's a losing proposition. And I say the beginning point, I think, of really downsizing government is saying, okay, this is what we want to do. We want to, one, have invincible self-defense, shut down these 800 military bases abroad. We have enough power to destroy the whole world 50 to 100 times over. And that was that during the Cold War, it deterred anybody from attacking us, which can do the same at present. And the other thing we have to say, we do not need, a welfare state. We can have a safety net, but otherwise everybody marches to their own drum. We give them the opportunity to learn. We give them second chances to learn. That's why I would have through education, and I try to have education very, very low in terms of cost. But if you flunk out, that's your problem, not the government. That is what gives us pride, because we did it on our own. Who can be very, very filled with self-esteem for accepting a government handout? You can't. You'd have to delude yourself. We understand as human beings, we get a sense of confidence and reward and fulfillment because we did it on our own. And we deserve credit for that. We give people second chances. We understand not everybody's born in the same circumstances, but we have to get a new vision, the old vision, if you will. We need a new birth of the framers' understanding of why we're a country. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're going to go off the cliff like every single prior empire. Overextension, deficits, wars permanently. You're always on a warfare legal architecture. And it's going to crumble at some point. It's just a matter of time. And it's not because we're going to be invaded. It's because we're going to crumble from within, just like the Roman Empire.
Yes, I think a precondition for being able to cut the budget is to have the type of conversation that Ronald Reagan had with the American public. The limited success, but maybe there would have been more success if every other president that succeeded Reagan engaged in the similar conversation to the American public. When people judge Reagan's success or failure, I give him credit for a lot of success, because I think if it wasn't for Ronald Reagan, we wouldn't have balanced the budget into the year 2000. When Bill Clinton got elected president, he said, one is when he managed the transition. From what I read, the first person he met to discuss his transition effort was with Ronald Reagan. Not because they agreed ideologically completely, but because it was his acknowledgement that Reagan ran a very efficient administration and an efficient transition and got a lot done through legislation, not executive order. With a Democrat.
Remember, Bill Clinton said the era of big government is over. That is an echo chamber of Ronald Reagan.
Right. That's why I say that we got to that balance in 2000, because of Reagan changed the conversation of the role of government in society. Okay. So who brought big government back was George W. Bush, with his quote compassionate conservatism, which says, no, we don't really believe that the era of big government is over. We can have a big enlightened government, and so we've been on this path of the big enlightened government, and then we accepted big government. Only then, after having 8 years of Bush, Obama said, I like big government, but I'm more enlightened than George Bush is, and then we had Trump elected and said, I also like big government, but I'm more enlightened than either Bush or Obama. Okay, then Biden came in and said, I like big government, but I'm more enlightened than Trump or Obama or Bush. And now we have Trump back in saying, I also like my big beautiful bill, which is a big government bill, and big government is beautiful. Only I'm more enlightened than all my predecessors. So the conversation about the role of government, I saw polls recently, is that more and more Americans expect government to solve more and more of our problems, rather than individuals solve more of the problems. So I think the big failure has been the political class, Democrats and Republicans, that have each sold a big government agenda, with the illusion that really giving the government more money can solve all our problems, and so the language of the current political class is very different than the message Reagan communicated clearly, successfully for a period of time to the American people, is that don't look to Washington for the answers to all your problems, okay? And that was an America that believed in itself. That was an America that had self-respect. That was an America that was respected all over the world. And it was respected all over the world, not because you had a blowhard in the White House insulting and threatening people every other day. So you had a president who acted with dignity in the White House, treated all others with dignity and respect, and had a solid foundation of principles that he believed in, and that were communicated not only by him but by his entire administration. Of the fact is that we have to go back to what made America great, which was the vision of the founders, which is a limited government, and that we look to solve our own problems. When we have problems, we don't look to the government for help. And it was Reagan who said, the most dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm here from the government. I'm from the government. I'm here to help." So, and as you just said, Clinton acknowledged that the era of big government was over, and that was an acknowledgement of the success Reagan's messaging had in changing people's attitude towards their relationship with the government and the responsibility they have for themselves.
And I want to pick up with one thing you said, Jeffrey, because it reminds me of a statement by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, perhaps the wisest of all. And he said, "You need to be most alert to defend liberties when government's purposes are allegedly benevolent. Says if they're really openly evil, then you're likely to be on your guard. But when government says, 'Oh, I'm here to help you,' they're benevolent. They're going to destroy you, even though their ambitions seem to be in your favor." And that's what and again, the reason isn't because the government is necessary to have evil people. But remember, humans have ulterior motives. The government, presumptively, because they want power and money. Their ulterior motive is not to go out of business. It's just like if you set up a business, who sets up a business thinking, "This is how I'm going to drive myself out of business"? It doesn't happen. And the reason why, in my judgment, government has continued to grow year after year after year is because the occupants of office have an ulterior motive to want it to get bigger because they run it. They have more money to spend. They have more money to leverage over other people. They have more power to give them social status and prestige. And one of the reasons why they have that attitude, I believe, Jeffrey, is because without, the adornment of power, they're not really serious people. They're not a Thomas Jefferson who can go establish the University of Virginia. And so they know they have to keep government big because that's what gives them their status. If you're really as a serious person, you have a status of who you are, because what you say and what you've accomplished, how you can write and how you can speak, whether you're in office or not. We don't cultivate those people anymore. And that's why, in some sense, on both sides of the aisle, elected officials, they cling to office even when they're virtually in their grave. Whether it's Dianne Feinstein or Katie Granger or somebody, they cling to the office even when they're adult because they really are not serious people. And one of the things that we have difficulty in attracting to the government in order to start to shut it down is somebody who says, "I don't need government. I can shut it down. It's not going to bother me. I'll go make universities. I'll try to teach and edify and provide wisdom. I don't need to be in office." And so they don't have this secondary motive to keep it big. But we don't create those people anymore. And those people that might exist, they don't want to be in government because it's a huge mess. And that's kind of the paradox that we're in, I think, at present. I mean, Donald Trump, you would say, well, why should he want government big? Well, because that's what gives them the ability to be the center of attention. And that's what his motivation is. Government big or small, he knows as long as he's there and not shutting government down, he knows he can attract all the headlines in the news and TikTok and get all the followers. So that's what's going on. We do not need people of that sort. We need George Washingtons who say, "I want to go back to Mount Vernon, and I will as soon as I can." And he still was this person who was heroized after he was out of office because of who he was. He became a legend out of office, maybe hero as a military official. And we need to obviously develop and cultivate a culture that produces people like that again.
Yeah, I think the only way to get fiscal discipline, which is one of the things that I'm disappointed in this conversation in Washington, is the fact is I think the failure of having a relationship between government and money has been an abysmal failure. Um, as we talked about previously, we went through before we had a Fed, we had a stable price regime. The only time prices were not stable was during the Civil War and the War of 1812. Where we basically deviated from a sound money regime to fund the wars, which is another consequence of wars. Usually to have a war, you abandon sound money regimes, and you have to get a corrupt money regime to finance wars. But other than that, basically, like government debt would be priced by market prices. Now we have intervention, whether it's, I think Besant, I read, had intervened in the most recent Treasury auction because it was an unsuccessful auction. And why Trump has been asking Powell to lower interest rates is that they want the Fed to subsidize the issuance of government debt. So we're not letting the markets clear, in the market pricing of debt. If we took a look at, like, during the period of time, during the COVID, when we printed a lot of money and expanded the debt, which is the biggest reason, in my opinion, we had the inflation in the beginning of the Biden term, which was because we had an unprecedented expansion of the money supply, during COVID. So as soon as the economy opened up, there was a lot of money to spend, because of all the free money given out and all the money printed, and people went to spend, before the supply chains got to be, put back into place, and that caused, a temporary inflation, and the Fed then started withdrawing money from the money supply, and then we saw a very quick reduction of inflation. So it was pretty quick, the reduction of inflation.
But Jeffrey, I think that you're only going to get rid of the government control of the money. You got to get rid of the warfare state. It's not an accident that the Fed was created on the eve of World War I.
Yes.
We went from 1 billion to 29 to 30 billion in debt. And the Secretary of Treasury, William McAdoo, under Wilson, said, there's no way we can fund this war by raising taxes. We got to have, the Liberty bonds, whatever else advertising vehicle they did. That's why you have the Fed. When the Bank of England was created in 1600s, it was created to fund the British Empire's emerging efforts to expand all over the world. If you can do without a central bank, you got to get out of the warfare state. Otherwise, you're going to get it in one form or another. Now, remember also that we had no central bank. Didn't even have the second bank of the United States. It expired in 1836. We didn't have any central bank of the United States at all up until the Fed.
Right.
So, and at that time, as you were pointing out, price stability, the country took off economically.
Yes.
So, but then once we decided an empire with the Federal Reserve in World War I, then it's done. That's what's going to happen. But you can, if we jettison the warfare state, we can get rid of the Fed.
Yeah, well, I don't. It's still hard for me to really appreciate. Really source of extreme disappointment to me why people can't think the simplistic concept that that I think is simple and powerful concept is that the government should not spend any more money than the people are willing to fund the government. It should just be that simple. And the government should not spend more money than people are willing to contribute to the government. So the government should not be issuing debt. The government should be as big as the people are willing to support a big government, and not bigger than that. And if the people don't, because ultimately that what you're doing is you're issuing debt and making government bigger based upon a future generation being burdened with the debt, so that a current generation could get benefits that they have no expectation or interest in paying off themselves. So they want the free lunch. So
Jeffrey, I would analogize it, Jeffrey, to this.
For the political class.
Yeah, Jeffrey, it's like
that concept that the government should not be any bigger than what people's vote on how big government should be by their willing to contribute to government, and it should be, government should not be any bigger than that.
Yeah, I think, Jeffrey, the analogy is, what would you think of parents who said, let's borrow all sorts of money and then we'll have our kids pay it off or the grandkids pay it off? You'd say they're wretches, right? Who are they? They say, well, let's borrow so that we go on yachts, we go on trips around the world, and then the grandkids can pay it off. He said that, that should never, but that's exactly what's happening in generational terms by the phenomenon that you've accurately described. Borrow, and okay, then you'll pay back the bonds. Somebody else will have to pay the interest and pay back the principal. That's just a wrong way to do it. Now, in George Washington's farewell address, he specifically understood this issue, and he said, you need to end any deficits as fast as possible, because it's so unfair to burden a future generation for paying for the benefits of an existing one. That's in his farewell address. And Jeffrey, right up until 1900, we had presidential campaigns over what are we going to do with the surplus.
Right.
We have government surpluses. Can you imagine? I mean, that hasn't happened in 100 years. But that was because they were abiding by the farewell address wisdom. I mean, and you're right, this is not hard. We understood this 200 years ago. How can we be that dumb today?
Yes. Thomas Jefferson also said the same thing. Yeah. And he thought it was unfair for one generation to burden another generation, which is why he thought all debt issued should be paid off in 16 to 19 years. Yeah. And he considered that a fatal flaw of the Constitution, not stipulating in the Constitution that all debt had to be paid off so that no generation, so there would never be an intergenerational transfer of debt. So yes, our founders thought, ultimately they left it up to us, but they gave their wisdom about what was required to keep our republic. And it seems to me the American people are really not interested in a constitutional republic. So I just think there's very little public support for a constitutional republic. When there's a lot of sympathy for the arguments that Trump makes is he was elected with a mandate, and the Constitution should not get in the way of that mandate, because the Constitution's getting in the way of reflecting what he claims is the will of the people. It's not really the will of the people, because again, he didn't get 50% of the vote. He got a plurality, but not a majority. And we don't know whether the people have really issued a mandate for him to violate the Constitution. And
you can't, Jeffrey. I apologize. I got to hammer this home because it's so recurring and so mischievous. You cannot have a mandate to violate the Constitution. You can have a mandate to try to amend the Constitution. I mean, one of the things Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932. One of his mandates was to seek repeal of the Prohibition Amendment, and he did it. 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states. You can't have a mandate to destroy and be an arsonist to the constitutional structure. And that reason is because the Declaration of Independence celebrates more than simple majority rule, unalienable rights to every individual to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Even if everybody hates him, he still has those rights. They're natural rights because they're human beings. We need to remember that. And that's why the Constitution has the checks and balances. And it means that no, majorities don't always get their ways. There's some rights that don't depend upon the outcome of an election. You got to understand that. It's a very simple understanding that was there at the time of the creation. And that's why we protect minorities from being strangled by majorities. Not in all cases. There's certain areas where the majority does rule. But in some areas that we feel are very central to the idea of liberty, the majority doesn't get to rule. We have these rights of liberty, due process, free speech, no matter what the majority says. Freedom of religion, another one. That is enshrined in the Bill of Rights. We got to understand. These are fundamental things that every school child understood 200 years ago. Now, even adults don't understand. That's the real problem.
Yes, it's and apparently either they have the capacity of understanding and don't want to understand, or they don't have the capacity of understanding. So I assume very few Americans read the Constitution. So I think when they hear these, I don't think many Americans are hearing these. When Trump says, these are activist commie judges, that are radical, and they're preventing me from Trump from doing my job, as opposed to they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is upholding the Constitution. How can anyone know what the merits of that argument is if they don't read the Constitution themselves? So if they don't have any knowledge of what's inside the Constitution, how can they make a judgment on what is a constitutional argument or a post-constitutional argument? They have no basis to even understanding, the issues. And that's our responsibility. People, it's funny, people throw around the word, I'm a citizen, I get all these benefits, and I hate all these illegals because they're not citizens, they were uninvited, they came here uninvited, we gotta deport them out. But I get to vote, I have all these privileges, but I have no clue about what the Constitution is. I have no clue about civics are. So all I want is I want my free lunch from the government, and I don't think I'm getting enough from the government. I want even more from the government. So while I'm busy, while most of the deficit is associated with the things I want from the government, I'm not willing to pay for, not what illegals are getting from the federal government, because the illegals get very little from the federal government. So it's the citizens who are causing the deficit because they want a lot more than they're willing to pay for. They want free lunch, and they want, first they want a free lunch at McDonald's, and then they want a free lunch at Shake Shack, and then they say, okay, that's not good enough either. So now I want a free lunch at Le Bernardine or Lutèce or Il Molino, or the fanciest restaurants in the world, because I first I was appreciative when I got a free lunch at a McDonald's. But now I want even much better food. I want more value in my free lunch, and so that's what people seem to be asking for. But
it gets even crazier, Jeffrey. It gets crazier than that. I mean, there years ago there was a lawsuit brought. It's a very, very, I think, symbolic, against somebody who sued McDonald's, saying, "You made me fat because you made the cheeseburgers and Big Macs too tasty," right? You talk about irresponsibility. I mean, you got to be really. You said that'd be like, okay, you sue Peter Paul Rubens because he made nudes too attractive and it made you attend brothels. Listen, we got to take responsibility for our own actions. And Madison said, among other things, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. We live in an age where you can go online. If you know where to search, you can get all the greatest, wisest books, information in the world. You have to take that responsibility on if you want to live in a free society. The nature of the species naturally tends towards tyranny, towards one-man government, towards a lack of free speech, because people love certainty. Just give me the playbook to get me into heaven. Don't ask me. But if you want to live in a different society, you have to swim uphill. And that means get educated so you can be part of the Sentinel, protest injustice, protest stupidity, being engaged in the debate that sets the ground rules for how government acts. If you don't, we know exactly what's going to happen. It's happened to the 70 previous empires. We're going to go under. And the Lincoln Memorial, or that, what you can see, the Congressional building, it's going to look like the Roman Colosseum, crumble, because we were indifferent. We didn't want to accept the responsibility of self-government. You just can't, let other people do the work. I don't want to be engaged. I want to attend a Taylor Swift concert, or I want to go on TikTok. I want to do something that's irrelevant. That's certainly not how we won the American Revolution. I could guarantee with that attitude, we'd still be a British colony.
Yeah. And when mentioning TikTok, I want to remind, this is something I sent to you, and I want to remind everyone who's watching, who might watch this later, is anytime you hear anyone from the Trump administration tell you that no one is above the law, that's bullshit. Okay. TikTok is above the law. Okay. Yeah. I'm not saying it's only TikTok, but TikTok is a clear example, because why is TikTok still in the app stores? TikTok is still in the app store because even though Congress said they needed to be removed from the app store, and that was supposed to be done during sometime in January, I think, of this year, and we're already 6 months later, approximately 6 months later, and it's still there. And why is it there? Because the government has said they're not going to enforce that law. So basically, so Apple and Google say, well, a lot of people want to interact with TikTok, so we'll keep it in the store, and we'll even recommend it, even though it's a threat to national security, because we're told by the administration is that this is a law they're not going to enforce. So,
and think about, we want to pause for a second, Jeff.
If the government chooses not to enforce a law against an entity that's deemed a threat to national security, then how could you ever make the statement that no one is above the law? Unless that's just pure utter bullshit.
Yeah, it is, because if you look at Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, it says the president is obligated to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. We know the origin of that clause. It was the English Bill of Rights of 1689, where the Parliament was upset and they overthrew King James II because he wasn't enforcing the laws. They oftentimes targeted Catholics at that time, since Britain was an Anglican country. So the framers understood, and the English Bill of Rights, 1689, says specifically, the president, the king and queen cannot decline to enforce a law without the consent of Congress. I mean, the Parliament, right? And so that's carried over. Because you could see, Jeffrey, the equivalent, the refusal to enforce a law is the equivalent of an absolute line item veto. That is, you can just say, I don't need to get Congress to repeal a law. I'll just make it null and void by non-enforcement. That makes a joke of the fact that the legislative branch is supposed to be able to control legislation. And moreover, it hasn't been just limited. First of all, there isn't any bright line that would enable you to argue that if a president can decide he doesn't want to enforce the TikTok law, then he can decide, I don't want to enforce the laws against murder. I don't want to enforce the laws against fraud. I don't want to enforce the laws against immigration. I don't want to enforce the laws against guns. I mean, he can pick and choose and decide any law he wishes, he can make null and void on his own. It's exactly what the British.
What did Pam Bondi say by the actions of Pam Bondi? This mayor in Newark ended up being more of a criminal than TikTok, even though TikTok is deemed a national security threat, and what was it, supposedly trespassing when he was actually invited in. So by the people who owned the property or the people who had use of the property, that he was invited in, and I guess they didn't check to see whether he was really invited or not. They just decided to put him in handcuffs and arrest him, not even knowing whether he was there or not. And again, it's interesting that now, I guess, in the Congresswoman is now asking for discovery of, or I guess he is asking for discovery now, because he's countersuing, asking for what were the conversations DHS might have had with people in Justice Department. So he wants to know who actually made this decision and why this decision was made.
Yeah, because they dropped the suit against him, Jeffrey. They dropped the suit against, so he's suing them for false arrest.
He's now suing them. Yeah.
He says because they dropped without any explanation. They said, "Okay, we don't have any evidence," and walked away. But I want to go back again.
Well, they probably had evidence. They probably had evidence. Is the fact
they exonerated him.
That exonerated him and showed that they were the bad actors. They probably had the evidence. If we go to court, we have to go to court, with basically saying, yes, he was invited on. We asked the people at the GEO, and they said, yes, they invited him on. And then DHS came in and decided that even though GEO granted him access, they were not going to grant him access. And after he had left, they were going to arrest him when he was no longer even on the property, that they were going to go arrest after he had already left. So, and apparently, does the DHS have any evidence that GEO gave them instructions to represent the interests of GEO with respect to their relationship with the mayor? I'm sure if they would have gone to trial, they would have learned all this, but they decided to arrest him anyway without doing any investigation. So
and then drop the charges so they don't have to produce any discovery. Yes. But I think Jeffrey.
But going back to that, they say it's bull. I want to say they don't believe. If you look at all the pardons, they believe a lot of people are above the law. Okay, that the law doesn't apply to a lot of people. So when they say no one is above the law, that's bullshit. To them, the law doesn't exist. It's just their ability to use force at their discretion that they want backed up by the courts. And if the courts don't back up whatever they do at their discretion, then they demean the courts.
Yeah.
So they don't care about rule of law at all. And the sanctuary cities can say the same thing that they say about TikTok. Yeah, there's a law, but in our jurisdiction, we're choosing not to enforce the law, like you're not enforcing the law against threats to national security. In our jurisdiction, we're doing the same thing. We're not enforcing, your laws. Go ahead.
Well, it's a little bit. Let me make a couple observations, Jeffrey. The most important one is that the reason why we're having this conversation is because Congress has abdicated its responsibility. It has become a decoration. It's become wallpaper. It does not discharge its role as the lead branch in separation of powers, because what the framers expected, if a president just decided not to faithfully execute a law enacted by Congress, is they would impeach and remove him. Said if there's any instance where you have a what we call a political offense, it's the president, despite the fact that Congress, by majorities in the House and Senate, passed a law, maybe sometimes over veto, and then president deciding he's taking on the whole constitutional structure. But because Congress has surrendered its prerogatives and does nothing, that's why we're out of kill. It goes back to Congress. These things wouldn't be happening if Congress said, it's our law, you have to enforce it. Remember, they got rid of King James II when he wasn't enforcing parliamentary laws. That's what we're going to do to you unless you enforce the laws. And that's why we're in these contortions. We're seeing things that are quite dismayed because Congress isn't doing its job. Right. It's not doing nothing. In fact, it's surrendering power to the executive. You tell us what to do. We will not sanction you for anything, no matter how egregiously unconstitutional. Yeah, now, the separate issue is, the sanctuary cities. It's complicated because immigration is a federal issue. It's not something that is governed by state laws. And the Supreme Court has said that if the federal government has a federal law, they can't conscript the state machinery to enforce the federal law. They can, right. The state machinery, if it can volunteer to do it, but they have their own independent right to execute state laws, which does not include immigration laws. So that's why I think you're going to find, and trying to draw the line between some states say we will cooperate with you, and some states no, we're just going to hold it's your job, it's your federal issue. You can deport all the immigrants that you can find and prove are here illegally with federal resources. It's a federal issue. Anyway, it's a complicated federalism question that still has some gray areas to be sorted out. But I want to continue because, to my mind, and I've written a book called Congressional Surrender. I said it all goes back to the spineless Congress. Does nothing. It has basically said when we take our oath to support and uphold the Constitution, we really mean we're going to support and uphold anything that helps our political party. And if my party's in the White House, give the White House limitless power. That's what it's degenerated into.
Yeah, because really, if each one of them branches believed in rule of law, which they don't, okay? So I want to keep reminding the people, anytime you hear anybody in Washington, anyone at all, say they believe in rule of law, they're full of shit, okay? They're bullshitters. And, and sorry for my choice of words, but really, it is, I don't want to use a softer word on something that's such a repulsive concept that them claiming that they have any interest in rule of law. They have no interest in rule of law. The law is a weapon to be used against people they want to use it against. So it's not prosecution of the law, it's persecution by law. So they're persecutors. They're not prosecutors, they're persecutors. So, and
I want, Jerry, I apologize to jump in, but I want to remark that this Edward Martin, who's now in the Justice Department, has said openly, we're going after you, even if we can't prove that you're guilty of a crime, because we want to shame you.
Right.
Really? I mean, That by itself is an impeachable statement.
Even if you did nothing illegal, we want to shame you. That's the role of government. Okay. Yes, I want to have efficient government. I want to hire people to shame people I can't convict. So I'm going to hire the department of people to shame people I can't convict. Okay. That's what George Washington and James Madison had in mind. Gee, let's get the department of shame. Okay. Let's get all these people in government of the executive branch spend time and resources devoted to shaming people that they can't convict of a crime. So, and people applaud this stuff. So, but but the point I made is, if they really believed in rule of law, like with the TikTok example, it's a very simple thing. All Congress says is, we passed the law, we passed it on a bipartisan basis. We gave you a little bit of time to negotiate a deal. You couldn't get a deal done. Meanwhile, this threat to national security continues to grow and becoming a greater threat. So very simple, okay? Either come back to us with a proposal and an argument to convince us we were wrong, that it's not really a threat to national security, okay? Or enforce the law, and then Trump could go back and say, well, this was decided during the Biden administration. I know it was done on a bipartisan basis. I think you were wrong, and I'd like you to hold another vote on it again, and I'd like to have a debate with the public, and it'd be either it would be confirmed that they are a threat to national security, and then they would have to, then I'll enforce the law, or Congress will have changed its mind and voted that that they made a mistake and it's not really a threat to national security, and they can keep operating. Anyone who is really interested in rule of law, that's what they would be doing. Okay, it's that simple. It's not complicated. If you believe in rule of law, it's not complicated. Okay, it's very simple. If you really believe in rule of law, they do not believe in rule of law. None of them. They do not believe in rule of law. They are all bullshitters every time they mouth those words. Okay, it's disgusting that they ever use those words for a concept, for a principle they have zero belief in. Zero. Okay, yeah. Sorry, Bruce, but I feel very passionate about this.
No, yeah, you're right on, and it's important. This is who we are as the people. This is what gave birth to the country. I mean, I remember 2006. These are the leadership people, not just the junior varsity leadership. Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker of the House. She says impeachment's off the table. I said, this is Cheney and Bush. I said, really? You just waited out the impeachment clause? How could you do that? You're one person. Well, it might impair our ability to win the White House in 2008. You know what? That's not a good reason for flouting the Constitution. It's still there. Impeachment is still there. Anyway, that's it. But it's on both sides. I spoke once to former Speaker Robert Livingston from Louisiana. I said, Robert, you got to go back and give Congress more power. There's oversight is totally dysfunctional. He said, Bruce, I'm never doing anything to give Nancy Pelosi more power. Well, wait a minute. Don't give the Constitution. It's the institution you're giving more power, not your personality. But those are just examples of the mentality that's destroying the country. We can't operate that way. There are rules of deciding on the merits to do these things in a legal way. And they're there not just because they're academic ideas coming out of Montesquieu or Madison. Real life shows they're necessary. We know what happens when you don't do due process. 120,000 Japanese Americans, among others, get put in concentration camps, even though they're the most loyal group perhaps in all of World War II. We know that's what happens when you don't give due process. You make errors all the time. And there's never been a showing where due process actually handicapped us from doing anything. What's the problem? Wait, you can get evidence. Where's the urgency? And that's why it's so critical to keep coming back to the central point. Because if we don't get that right, I can guarantee everybody on this program, the successor to Donald Trump is not going to yield one whit of power back unless Congress says we're going to impeach or remove you. Without that, it has never happened in the history of the world that an executive voluntarily says, here, let's give your power back. It does not happen.
Yeah. And I'd like to thank you for the Bills Congress, and I would like to welcome on Ryan. And I think that maybe this might have been, I guess whenever there's a misunderstanding, I guess me as the host should take responsibility for many misunderstandings.
It's the time change, as always.
I think it was confusion between Eastern time and Central time.
Yeah, as always.
So I think, I did not make it explicit enough, and I think your assumption was that we'd be starting at noon Central time, and
No
when it
worries.
was in time. And so my apologies for not making it clear that which time zone noon referred to.
I do it. I do it all the time. It was probably my fault. So no worries.
Great to have you here, Ryan. So so I would want the audience to know that Ryan's not just late because he decided to show up an hour late. That Ryan's on time for his understanding of what time he was supposed to appear. So thank you for being here, Ryan. And why don't since Bruce and I have been talking for an hour now, why don't you tell us what you're thinking about? What are the things you'd like to talk about?
Well, for risk of maybe being redundant, because I'm not sure if you guys already touched on some of the things that we were talking about earlier. The two things that I had kind of returned back in the chat that we were discussing earlier, and the one that I think stands out that I think is important to start with, and I do have one thing actually that at some point I maybe want to get you guys' thoughts on, but is the point around the let me pull up the link real quick, the letter, and around the immigrant that was accused of threatening Donald Trump. And I think the case you guys haven't touched on it, the point is simply that it's already kind of, you haven't yet? Okay, well, the case is simply that the letter was presented as evidence that an immigrant who technically was here on a visa, I think it was a work, I forget the exact nuance of it, but that was technically here on a visa and sent the claim was the letter was sent threatening Trump's life, which was used in this massive propaganda push to claim not only are all immigrants threats, that here they're threatening Trump and so on, very quickly turned out to be a forgery that was pushed back. And as far as I could tell, multiple times now it's fleshed out to the point where not only they proven he didn't write it, but that now evidence has come out that a person who's currently about to be, I think he's currently in jail, but either way the case is he's the one that is has a case against him for a crime against the person they're accusing of sending the letter. And that he set all this up to get this person deported before that case could come to trial. And I'm just going, so that in and of itself is insane to talk about, but the implications of that people are taking advantage of the frivolous, by the seat of their pants nature of this crazy deportation campaign to the point to where they want to, take advantage of it to get their personal things hidden behind the deportations. I just find that to be so chilling and what a good example of what a problematic position we're in, so I just want your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That and people are exploiting that bigotry or disrespect for due process. I remember in different regards, I remember after the Oklahoma City bombing, everyone said it's got to be a Muslim immigrant, that's who killed. No, it's Timothy McVeigh, but then the jump, it's got to be somebody you hate without due process. No, the whole idea. We live in a culture that judges individuals, not groups. We don't do collective punishment here, not from the beginning, and I hope we never would ever do it. But that's the mentality that we're embracing. Collective punishment, collective suspicion. No, each individual gets to be judged as that individual. And that means due process. Maybe somebody else did it, but you got to get this individual right to present evidence. And I don't understand what's so hard by saying, okay, I understand the accusation, but I'm not going to decide till everyone's had a fair chance to respond and to produce the evidence. That's why we have trials. How do you know? You can have tentative views, but say, I'm not going to decide anything definitively until I hear the other side. And unfortunately, though, that understanding of process seems to go out the window. We need to, what's one thing that should be inculcated, I think, in every student, even in elementary school. We had a very famous evidence maven called Henry Wigmore, and he said, cross-examination is the greatest engine ever discovered to unearth truth. Cross-examination. So wait till cross-examination, then decide. Until then, people can say whatever they want, and we know people have ulterior motives all the time. It doesn't mean they're always wrong. It doesn't mean they're always right. That's why you have due process. You got to listen to both sides. That's what civilization is about. The very first person who thought to himself, I could be wrong. Got to listen to other sides. That was the first step towards civilization. We should never forget that.
Yeah, I think that Ryan, this is a non-trivial point you wanted to talk about, because I think it does reflect the fact is that the administration is acting in bad faith, that they want to have a narrative, and anything they get that helps support that narrative, they welcome, and they welcome without due diligence. They welcome without vetting. It's the same thing that, they're eating their cats, they're eating the dogs. I read it somewhere. So they pick up any story from anywhere. They don't care what the source is. They don't care if it's a reliable source. They don't care if it's a validated source. They don't care if it's fake news. If it fits their narrative, they're going to use it. And think about how they screwed up this guy's life.
Yeah.
I mean, they get out without any investigation. The one thing that we might have, Bruce and I talked about, that might have been somewhat similar is the mayor that was arrested in Newark, and then the charges were dropped.
Right.
So, I mean, they didn't do an investigation. They arrested him without an investigation. So, and probably after they did the investigation, then they said, "Oops, we got to drop the charges because we're not going to look good." So, so they're just doing things that fit a narrative of a story they want to tell. So they want to, what the narrative, their story is they want to protect the American people against all these violent immigrants. And here you have this one person threatening Trump's life. You have another one going in, trying to break into this prison and free the people there and let them out. I mean, so they're using this all for PR purposes.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about rule of law. They don't care about process and anything that will help them tell a story that they can control the narrative with the news media. That's all they care about, is how can I control the narrative that they get, the news stories that gets out. Because once the story gets out, then the ability, I've told this, a number of times that there's this story about, this guy who goes to his rabbi and he says, I did something terrible. I spoke something bad about this person. What can I do, Rabbi, to undo the damage I did? And the rabbi tells him, well, on a very windy day, go into the center of town and break open your feather pillow and break it open, and then come back and tell me what you saw. So the guy does that. He waits for a windy day. He goes to the center of town, breaks open the feather pillows, and he's watching the feathers disperse all over the place. So then he goes back to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I did what you did. Am I now forgiven? No, the rabbi said, now go and pick up all the feathers. And the guy says, that's impossible. And the rabbi says, correct, that's right, it's impossible. Once you do it, it can't be undone. So once the lie gets out there, okay, the retraction of the lie is because the lie will never be retracted. There'll just be silence, okay? Pam Bondi's not going to go up and say, I'm apologizing to this person, for getting on national TV and calling this people threatening and making another example of how illegal immigrants are so outraged that they want to assassinate the president because that's the narrative I want to tell, and apologize to them. No, they just won't talk about it anymore. And so, but meanwhile, the mainstream media or other media will cover the story, but the MAGA media is going to ignore the story. So 90% of the MAGA people will still believe that this person did this threat. So for their purposes of PR, they probably have been successful. And
I think Jeffrey. Mark Twain put it this way. Mark Twain said, right, lies get halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on. It's a quick graphic way to explain this phenomenon. And that's what these people are exploiting. Yeah, lies there. We're already halfway around the world. Truth hasn't got its trousers on yet, and maybe it's too late to get the trousers on. And so they exploit the attitude that people who want to believe the lies at the first instance will believe it, and that the truth will never catch up with it. It's really quite cynical. And instead of saying what they should say, we've had these allegations, but there's presumption of innocence. We need to have more information. And when we do, then we'll give out that information. They tout this as being as factual as the force of gravity or something like that. It's not all that different from Goebbels in the Third Reich. Mm-hmm. This is what we'll do. If you tell the big lie over and over again, pretty soon people will believe it, especially when you have such a dominance, in the media, which is obviously what they do have. With all their social media contacts and otherwise.
I'm not really sure, in my personal opinion, whether I agree in general from some level, but I question whether the gnomes and even the Trumps of the conversation are truly the ones like playing this, or that they are the ones being played. You know, like it's hard for me to look at a gnome, for example, who can sit there and claim that habeas corpus is a right the president has to deport people, right? And then when pressed, you go, and Lincoln used it, like clearly doesn't know, right? Lincoln didn't use habeas. It's just so frustrating that that's not a mistake or a game. She didn't understand what she's talking about. And so you wonder, are they actually of the mind that what they're doing is somehow within the right of the president? And, you know, or are they using this and knowing they're wrong? Like my gut tells me these are people that are being used themselves, you know? And
they
so
may well be, but Brian, I think they don't care, which is alarming.
I agree with that
I
too.
think Kristi Noem cares one way or the other. She's there. She has a political role to play, and that's it. So, was right or wrong? Who cares?
I don't think they're being used. I think they're doing what they think will get them the positive attention of Trump. That's all I think.
I agree with that, but couldn't you see that being used?
I think they're doing what they're doing in a way that has them Trump think highly of them. So
I agree.
you know, and Trump is shameless, and given the fact if you're a shameless liar, okay, and you want to be an ally of a shameless liar, you have to transform yourself to a shameless liar to be successful at building a good rapport with someone who's a shameless liar and who wants you to reinforce their shameless lies. So,
and I think the case of William Barr points shows that you're spot on, Jeffrey. William Barr comes in; he's conservative attorney general as can be, and he's praised by Trump. You know, he dumps on the Mueller report or whatever. As soon as he went over to the White House, said, "There's no evidence. We chased down all these rabbit holes, couldn't find evidence of fraud that changed the outcome of the 2020 election." Then turns on him, and so then he's now in the doghouse. And Trump then calls him all sorts of names. Really? And this is because, you know, he understands that the only way you can get into the good favor of Mr. Trump is becoming an echo chamber and become a poodle. That's it. Anybody else who turns against him, I have no doubt, for example, that Mr. Trump is going to turn completely on Elon Musk, because Musk has now denounced, you know, his budget is just a totally monstrosity.
He kind of has already.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what it is. And these people aren't dumb. They know, okay, you want to get in the good grace of the White House, just do whatever Trump wants you to do, or do what you think he wants you to do. And that's how you achieve your good graces. Nothing else is going to work.
But my point is too, like, I agree with all that, but we can all see how that could be used. You know, like the willingness to just go along to get along is probably one of the easiest things to abuse, just pure self-interest, you know? And my point is not to, no commentary on who or what is doing it, but just the question of whether they're making conscious choices to lie for an interest, or that I think we all seem to agree that they're drinking their Kool-Aid. Like they are of this mind that like, this is how this is supposed to go. And that's kind of more terrifying in its own right, because they are building this kind of empire of people that are like, it's a religion is the best way to look at it. And that, how do you fight that?
Well, I think it's self-religion. I think what's terrifying is that I believe that these people could equally, it's like those who shifted between, you know, Stalin and Hitler, communism and fascism, and Nazism. I mean, they would do, if for power, they would shift their viewpoint 100% overnight in order to get power. I mean, that really is dangerous. And we've already seen that. If you look at all the people who ate their own words as serving the Trump administration, you know, Marco Rubio being one, all the things that he was favor of when he was not in the executive branch, now he's against, and vice versa. I mean, do you have no conscience? Are there nothing that you wouldn't do for self-interest? And when the answer is no, I'm for sale, then you have everybody's a Dr. Faustus, right? Do right. Faustian bargains, and that's the end of the rule of law in the United States of America.
I think that was I think that's the criteria for how the cabinet was chosen. Is will you completely sell out, and will you become a shameless liar on behalf of Trump? And they auditioned for how good they would be as attack dogs and shameless liars, you know, and their role model is Trump and Stephen Miller. And so they kind of know what behavior is expected of them if they want to have longevity in their positions and a future political career. Because remember, who's all the money going to for the Republican Party? Who controls all the Republican money is Trump. So whether he'll be president again in 2028 or not, you know, we'll have to see. But either way, he'll have a significant influential role in that process, because I don't think the party will, unless the administration ends up, you know, being extremely unpopular one, which is a possibility. Mm-hmm. You know, and then he will have amongst if he loses the independents, and therefore he might have money, but he'll have less leverage because he'll be perceived as having less popular support. But as long as he has the type of popular support he has now, and he has all the money, he'll control. They're all auditioning for who will be the one he will handpick to be his successor. If he wants a successor, or those who will stay as he decides to see if he can last longer as president of the United States than Xi lasts as head of the CCCP in China. So so Trump can be able to say nobody was president for any longer period of time. He wants to beat FDR, and he wants to be a president for 16, 20 years, so he could go down as the GOAT of the president who had the longest term in office. A record that will go in the Guinness Books of Records of how long someone was a president of the United States.
We're not going to, Jeffrey. We're not going to have any Guinness Book of Records. The whole country's going to be gone. It'll be trying to, do archaeology from the ruins of the White House and the Congress, the Lincoln Memorial. The people don't understand how fast countries can disintegrate.
Well, Bruce, on that point, which is really interesting, and since you have expertise in this direction in general, or just you guys are both well versed on this. How long do you think, so let's just say hypothetically, or eerily, seems like that's where we are, that our discussion around Congress and impeachment and doing nothing and just kind of cascading from that point forward to where it's the end of what we are, at what, let's just say that happens and it's official in the way we see it. How long do you think that takes before we're able to acknowledge that as a society? How long will this continue feigning to go through these processes that don't really have checks and balances? Do you think that just collapses? In history, is there any precedent that you know of to show you how long that feels like it'll take?
Well, some empires take a longer time to disintegrate. The Roman Empire took a couple centuries. It was slow. The Soviet Empire virtually disintegrated overnight. So there's not a track record that leads you to one or another. My own view is that what's likely to happen is we will fragment, we will balkanize, that the state will become a de facto secession without a civil war. And that will mean then the seceding states are likely to be dominated by a single party, and they will all end up being de facto dictatorships or kingships or something like that. Right. And will be weak because we'll be so divided. That's how I think we're going to become unglued. It's not going to be a foreign invasion or anything like that. But that's my prediction.
I'm expecting the collapse of the United States. I think we're 10 years away from the collapse of the United States. Not as a country, but as a superpower and as somebody relevant. And why do I say 10 years? We're not going to, in spite of the best efforts of a Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, we're not going to cut spending. So there's a limit to how much. Raising taxes would be counterproductive for economic growth. Cutting taxes and expanding the budget deficit is also bad for economic growth. So the only way to really accelerate economic growth is to reduce the role of government in society and in the marketplace. And there is no agenda amongst either party for doing so.
Yeah.
So what will be the events that will happen, within the next 10 years? Social Security, without new money coming in, will no longer be able to pay out what it's promised to pay out. So we'll get to a point where it's not that it's going to happen 10 years from now or tomorrow. It's that day will come, and then Congress will have to deal with a decision about what do we do? Do we pay all these many of these people who have paid into the system, but they've not paid in enough to get the benefits that they would like to have, who have no other savings, who live completely off Social Security, and do we now cut 25 cents at every dollar, out of their money, and see if they could continue to survive with 25% less income coming in, or then the question is now we have this generation where we got $50 trillion of fiscal debt, and we can no longer, and we're no longer AAA, we're single A or triple B plus or something like that. And our cost of credit is very high and mortgage rates are 10%. And then the generation that has no savings, that has all this debt, we're now going to have to tell them we're going to add to your debt by making you responsible for paying for your parents' and grandparents' Social Security. So then the question is what happens at that point in time? So we at 10 years from now, we won't be able to kick the can down the road anymore. because Medicare and Social Security, the funds, they will just run out of money. Okay. And there's going to have to be society is going to have to consent what to do about that. And I don't think we have the ability to reach a national consensus on those issues.
Yeah, I think this is where the CBDC, digital finance, like Catherine Austin Fitts has talked a lot about this in the financial overlap, and even the Bitcoin discussion as a strategic reserve. Basically the transition into that. And I'm no expert when it comes to the finance field, but on this topic, I can see how it would make sense, or how it could lead to a position where they could, in a way, there's like 2008 even, and as an example of sort of like recorrecting itself in a way that like prolongs the problem. I feel like that could happen again with some kind of a CBDC digital transition. What do you guys think about that?
I think, go ahead.
The
Bruce.
digital transition is not going to solve the debt problem.
Specifically CBDC, like a central digital financial,
CDC doesn't, if you're still taking in less income than you're spending, the debt continues to decline. And what Jeffrey hinted at is, if we do not cut the spending, the carrying cost of the debt alone will be the entire budget. There won't be anything more. If you take back to ordinary historical average interest rates on 10-year treasuries, 3.5%, 4.5%, and apply that to 50 trillion, the whole budget's going to be the carrying cost.
Yeah.
You can't possibly continue down this road. And I think that's where we're headed. And that's where I think there'll be a pressure to secede. Some of the countries, some of these states that feel that they could on their own, end up financially better, they're going to pull off and say, why the heck should we be part of this program?
Right.
And then, I can't get down to the granular details because contingencies are too great. But I think that's what's going to happen. Now, I believe, the only reason why we haven't disintegrated earlier is because other countries are equally or more stupid than we are. They're running the same dumb things that the United States is. So you can't go to an alternate currency. The dollar is still the international currency, because no other country provides a currency, despite the deficits, that has any bit like that stability. And that's why I think it'll be internal rot. It won't be invasion by China or Russia or any other country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you don't think, so the only solution you think is the reduction of government spending and
that is
in general?
Absolutely. And you have to begin. We've got to go back to two fundamental principles. We don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Invincible self-defense we can do like at 1/10 of the current $1 trillion plus national security budget. Next thing we do is, our mission is liberty, not government control in welfare states. We give you an opportunity, but the glory is marching to your own drummer. You make do how best you can. We understand not everybody's born in the same circumstances, so we have a safety net. But other than that, the government's got to get out of the way. Your fulfillment is your own handiwork. That has got to be our new lodestar, not what government can do for you, what you can do for yourself to give you pride. You work, you accomplish something. That's what makes you feel that it's wonderful to be an American, not because you got a handout. And that's got to be an ethic that's got to be inculcated from grade 1. It's got to be in the schools, the synagogues, churches, mosques, everywhere. We got to change who we are as people. We are so weak. We are so protected. I mean, the whole idea is microaggressions. You have a right to safe spaces where you don't have to listen to ideas that you don't like. I mean, really? You're that weak that you're shocked you can't deal with an idea that you may not immediately appreciate? And that's just crazy,
And the scariest part is that's on both sides of the paradigm right now.
Oh, it is.
That's what's so alarming.
Yeah, it is. It's not a right or left wing issue.
Yeah.
I think some of the things Trump is doing now that are being normalized could be the potential of the future, in the sense of, right now we have the army in the country doing law enforcement. Okay, so supposedly just for the border, but that's just a start. So the question is, so we're more and more militarizing the police. Okay, one thing. Two is that the Trump administration, through executive order, is expanding the immunities that the police enjoy. Okay, so and he's made the military now part of law enforcement. Okay, now they're working with companies like Palantir and all those countries, putting together data do surveillance over us, way beyond what historically has been done recently. They're putting that on steroids on the type of surveillance they're doing, which is why I believe that Musk was working on this project of getting all this data together of all the government. I mean, the point of it, people should understand the point of it being siloed, the data, was you were sending data to the government just to do a specific purpose, and it was not supposed to be used against you, okay? So now they're looking to get all the data so it can be used against us. That's the purpose of putting it together, is they want to use it against us. The pretext that they want to use is they want to go after his illegals, but ultimately that's not what they're doing. They're getting all the information on all the citizens of the country, because they want to be able to be more effective, at persecuting us. And then people will begin embracing the concept of due process. We don't need due process. What we need is a safe country. We're very insecure. We need safe, and we need a president with extreme wisdom who is going to apply force to keep us safe and happy. So what we'll start seeing is, the military coming in, a lot more surveillance, people then being advertised as being enemies of the public. It doesn't matter whether they're citizens or not citizens, and these people will be the enemies of the public, will be shipped off without due process to Antarctica, Libya, or whatever hellhole that we can find, and we'll just reduce the population by sending people to foreign gulags, and and maybe and then scaring the shit out of the rest of the population. So I see the kind of like the scenario, if you ever saw the movie V for Vendetta. Where they became control of the media, and they put out fake news, and maybe all news will become deep fakes, controlled by that could be all news could become deep fakes. The government will put out deep fakes, and then as Bruce pointed out, from the Mark Twain thing is that the truth is always way behind all the lies that'll be put out. To be bombarded with all these deep fakes. And they'll just get us to hate targeted groups, that will just ship out of the country. So that's what I see. To me, that's my likely scenario for the 2030s. That's my expectation, because power always wants more power. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
And under those circumstances, where there's so much disunity, Congress will be happy to delegate even more authority to any chief executive who is popular. So, so I think there's a chance that either we'll splinter off like Bruce said, or the most successful demagogue will come and all the branches of government, the legislative and executive branch, will defer to the demagogue, and the demagogue will implement these type of measures that for a period of time people will be happy with, until they're not happy with, once they learn that they don't really solve the problems they were hoping they would solve, but they're desperate, and in desperate times people take desperate measures, and they don't think things through carefully, and there's always the law of unintended consequences. So my fear is that this technology will be part Terminator and part V for Vendetta, and the only news we'll have exposure to will be all these, we'll be bombarded with the government creating all these deep fakes, and so we won't, there won't be any authentic news, and we won't know where to get anything. We won't know where to find authenticity. So that's my fear.
Well, there's always authenticity, and that's because there's certain elements of human nature that never change. Unless they want to wipe out, I can go on get Federalist Papers. I can read about Socrates. I can read Aristotle, whatever, online. And I think for the audience that we're addressing, even though if I was betting, I think the likelihood is strong that something like what Jeffrey has, his dystopia, is likely to become true. For us, we have to fight against it, right? Even if it's for posterity and we know we're going to lose. Because we need to remember the 56 who signed the Declaration of Independence, they didn't know they were going to win. That's why they said they were risking their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. The reason why we even have this program today is because those people took risks. We got at least to redeem, not have them die in vain, and try to do the same for our posterity. I don't want to over dramatize it, but that's how the world is.
Yeah.
You got to stand up and say, well, if it comes there, so what? I'm not succumbing to that outcome. Even if it doesn't succeed in the short run, who knows what may happen? You leave a legacy so posterity can pick it up and say, okay, if this happened, then we need to get it started again. It's what Lincoln referred to as a new birth of freedom, a new birth of liberty, and the rule of law. And if we need to set the foundation stones, so be it. That's our responsibility as individuals in the United States. I say, in some sense, all of us here in the United States, we won lottery tickets. We weren't born in Gaza. We weren't born in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs or whatever. We got opportunities by luck, the draw that we're here. We didn't do anything to be in the U.S. as opposed to Guyana or Venezuela. Okay, so with the lottery ticket comes responsibility. I think that's everybody's got to take away that kind of understanding.
Yeah. I mean, nothing worth doing or, that's, kind of real change is, rarely is that easy, that path. Yeah. I'd like to overlap this with something I thought that kind of connected to my mind. So you mentioned Palantir and the obvious nature of the consolidation, which has been going on for a long time. It's really coming to a head in this administration of the surveillance kind of database they're building. You mentioned the removal of the silent information. The main reason, and this has been publicly discussed, of that is not so much part of it, the access, but it's so that could be used to train these AI models, which is what they're doing with it, right? In addition to what you said. And so that's a whole other part of this, right? So the simultaneous agenda, to me, I see them as really as one, is what I believe is going to amount to, which by the way, right now is already happening in individual senses, but automated or AI government, which the bill they just passed allowed 10 years of no oversight on AI, and also outlined on the Commerce Department and others that they would start using AI automated decision-making processes. I mean, that's where this goes. And so the thing that connected my mind to what we were talking about is an interesting way to how, throughout history, we've seen a lot of problem, reaction, solution, kind of like Hegelian dialectic dynamic. And I thought that this made sense to where, okay, they drive us to a place to where, and this is just kind of theorizing around it, where we are saying the only solution is to reduce government and spending, which is what they're saying in a weird way too, but not doing it, but efficiency, less spending. And so the argument then becomes, what if we get pushed in a position where they rationalize why AI government, which is what they're currently building, is the only way to reduce government, reduce spending. My worry though, and that's all to set up this thought, is that then becomes the very thing this has always been about, which is a more, the same kind of authoritarian, despotic kind of direction we're going in, but with a centralized AI decision-making process that ultimately, even Eric Schmidt, I think 2 years ago on a podcast, said, we're going to get to a place in the future where AI will make decisions that may seem immoral, but it'll know better. Paraphrasing, but that is what he said. So I think I want to throw that out there for conversation, because there's another angle of that I think is very concerning. And maybe this is all leading to where we are being rationalized to why that needs to happen, as opposed to
we know we've seen this rodeo before in part. And this is, the Census Bureau, they promised a confidentiality, but during World War II, they shared the addresses of those with Japanese names so they could be herded into concentration camps in violation of the secrecy promise. So we know what the government's going to do with the information as soon as there's a crisis or whatever. They're going to use it against us. And there's going to be no due process. Hey, you got XYZ and AI told it, the probability is so-and-so. And now we already have been introduced into the lexicon, into the intelligence community, the concept of the not yet guilty. Okay, think of that, the not yet guilty, right? That's everybody. I mean, that is Orwellian taken to a new level.
Yeah.
And okay, those are the people that we got to spy on, because according to AI, we know when you are going to become guilty. Right now, you're not, but we know that's going to come time when you are going to become guilty. And that's going to be complete government control over all of our lives. They'll know all private information about us. And again, when I go back to this concept of, trying to make us safe and, diminish any threats, the whole kernel of the Fourth Amendment saying, no, we don't want absolute safety. We're putting handcuffs on government. They can't invade our privacy without having a threshold of probable cause. They said to themselves, we care more about liberty at this point than catching everybody. The price of liberty is some, bad people are going to go free. But the cost of not letting any bad people go free is we don't have any freedom anymore.
Right.
That's the whole concept of the Fourth Amendment, is saying No, we don't put safety above everything. We
Yeah,
put liberty above it, and you have to have reasonable thresholds in order to compromise the individual liberty. I mean, these understandings are just gone from the society.
Right.
Well,
Don't understand.
it's come full circle to where now they're using it's exactly like you just described, Bruce. As we all know, they're now pointing to the problem and saying the only way around that problem is to remove this. It's the whole liberty and safety conversation. What, Benjamin Franklin? I mean, it's our foundational ideas that people are forgetting. But I think that's the whole point, is we've been driven so far away from understanding why these things are important, and go nomen habeas corpus. Like they know these things as cartoon ideas, not the foundational pillars they really are. And that's, as you're saying, that needs to get back to being like day one education kind of stuff.
and it's obviously got to be reinforced much more strongly, than it is reinforced.
Yeah.
And it needs, and it clearly those elected to office, and whether you're Teddy Cruz, the best student at Harvard, who doesn't seem to want to give the country any lessons in constitutional jurisprudence and construction. So so the question is how do people get educated? And hopefully platforms like our conversation today, and hopefully more and more people will join that, and they will join not necessarily to advance a partisan agenda, but to advance a nonpartisan agenda of what makes America unique. And again, it's the respect for natural law, that every individual is born with rights, and no legitimate government can deprive people of rights, and they're illegitimate. And those rights are human rights. They're not national rights. They're not rights endowed. Now, we can only enforce these rules under our jurisdiction. This is what people are confused about. I don't know, really, this really angers me so much. The Constitution is clear. We can only set this framework on jurisdiction that we have some authority over. But anyone who enters this jurisdiction enjoys these privileges. You're not necessarily a citizen, okay? Doesn't mean you get to vote, but there are certain natural rights that are endowed to every human being, not every American, every human being. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to enforce that outside our jurisdiction, but they apply to everyone who enters this jurisdiction. Okay, and people don't understand that anyone who's in this jurisdiction enjoys those rights, because we believe those rights are rights that come from nature, not from government. They're endowed to every individual the moment they're born. So no government can take them away. Any government that takes it away is acting in an illegitimate way.
Absolutely. And I go back to even Nuremberg. This is outside of our technical jurisdiction, but we gave the Nazis accused of the most horrible crimes due process.
Right.
We said, no, we're not going to just put them up and shoot them. There are 19,600 pages in the Nuremberg trials. These are the chief Nazi leaders, Hermann Goering and the others. I've read all the documentation. The defendants were given discovery rights, cross-examination, they had witnesses, they could testify in their own defense, all those sorts of things. The most horrible crimes, even though there was more than substantial, circumstantial evidence, Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, really horrible things happened. We still gave them due process. And actually, some of them were ultimately acquitted, 3 or 4 out of the 21 major criminals. That's what it means to understand that the dignity of every individual means that we don't punish them, we don't kill them, we don't maim them, we don't harm them until we give them a chance to explain the charges or come forth with evidence against what you're accusing them of. And they have that right, even if they were born in the worst circumstances ever. Although it's true, as Jeffrey points out, we can only enforce it within our jurisdiction. There was an example where we went outside of our jurisdiction with a consensus of others, but we had the ability to play fair because we were the superpower after World War II. And that's what we gave to the Nazis. Now, it is not an accident that one of the judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals here for the District of Columbia Circuit, when they're questioning about the deportation under the Alien Enemies Act without due process, She remarked during oral argument, we even gave Nazis more due process in World War II. Are you saying these are the Nazis? I mean, she was stunned. But anyway, that's the discrepancy between Nuremberg, which is 1946, and today, which is like how many? It's 70, 80 years later. That's how far we have regressed in understanding due process.
Yeah, I think Bruce, you used the term words, I think very, very important. They need to be repeated over and over again. The dignity of the individual.
Yeah.
The dignity of the individual. This is a country founded on the belief that every individual has dignity. And while they're in our jurisdiction, they'll be treated with dignity. That's why part of it was meant to actually illustrate the point. But when in Madison's report to Congress in 1800, in discussing the Alien Sedition Acts, including the Alien Enemies Acts, which was part of the Alien Sedition Acts, he did talk about what are alien friends and alien enemies, and he was clear. It was a rhetorical point to make the point. But an alien friend was someone who came in and committed a crime, but they're still alien friends. They're not alien enemies. Alien enemies were people who are trying to overthrow the country.
Right.
So they were not criminals. So just think about the whole language we now we call somebody who did nothing more than cross the border without permission, lived here for 20 years and never broke a law and paid their taxes and built the family and established roots and are constructive members of their community. We're calling them domestic terrorists, okay, and alien enemies. So think about the sickness and the perversion of language. Do you think about how much Americans today really you think Donald Trump and Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi care about the dignity of the individual?
Clearly not.
But the other thing, Jeffrey, that you may have omitted with regard to the Alien Enemies Act, Madison made clear, even the strictest restrictions applied only when you have a declaration of war,
right?
Or we have been invaded. That even those restrictions were limited to those narrow circumstances. Now, there's not if you took a poll, I think, of every person in the United States and asked them, are we at war is Venezuela invading the United States, right? Not a single one would say yes. They'd say this is insane. And yet that is the argument that the Trump administration is making to federal courts, and they wonder why they lose.
Well, this is what's so interesting, and I believe we touched on this in one of our last conversations, is that, on its face, their argument is completely incongruent. Like, so what you're saying is that we're being, as you pointed out, the only way you can argue that is that, the Alien Enemies Act is that it's an invading force, as you very well laid out last time, as well as a state actor, right? And like an actual force. And so they're arguing that's the case, why this makes sense. But then their argument is the invasion is only in the case that Biden let immigrants in a massive scale. Like that's the same conversation. And those things don't add up to the right. They know that, and so it's so dishonest, but that's what gets people, the lie carries over, and the lie of even 20 million is a lie. It's much less than that, but it's still a lot. The point though, is that, and then whether that was Biden as a deliberate action I don't think that. I think it's a mixed bag of a lot of things. But the point is that a lot of these people that want to believe this have been fed the idea that we have such a big problem that it now creates the idea, or that the circumstance where due process is not possible. And it goes back to your point about the Nazis, the same point. Could they have then just said, oh my God, there's so many of them, it'll be too difficult, let's just skip due process? It's the same argument. And my point is out there, don't fall for that. It's obvious what they're trying to do. It's like we said earlier, especially when it's difficult, it's important that we do it the right way,
Yeah. That shows you that you care about it. In fact, the Trump administration is open and saying, well, listen, if we gave due process to everybody, it'd take us so long. Well, maybe if you did due process, you wouldn't be deporting people who shouldn't be deported.
Exactly.
That's kind of the idea. Oh, really? With the trial, it takes so long. So let's just do away with the trial. Just put them up and shoot them. That saves us a whole lot of resources. No, it goes back to Jeffrey's point. We understand the dignity of the individual means we have to treat everyone on an individual basis, right? Even if it takes longer than treating them collectively, because we don't do collective punishments. And we understand, I go back again, when you don't do that, you end up with 120,000 Japanese Americans, all innocent and loyal, into concentration camps. Their lives are destroyed, and you made 120,000 errors, not a single correct one. That's what happened. That's the price you pay when you don't do due process.
And the Sudanese discussion is, I think, an important example of that, right? Where the Sudanese deportations, and there's a mixed bag of who they were. The point is, and at least in my research, and tell me what you think, most of them very clearly appeared to be criminals. But the point was not about whether, and this is how they trick a lot of people as well, is we're not arguing in many of these cases that every one of them are innocent. It's that they all should be afforded due process, like we just outlined. And yet Miller comes in to make the argument that you somehow don't want illegal, rapist criminals to be deported. No one, even in the left, is saying that. It's simply that they obviously should have been given the process before that deportation took place. I just think it's insane that people can't.
Let me explain what the process is about. Under our own laws, again, which could be changed, you cannot deport someone to a country where there's reasonable risk that they would be tortured, right, or persecuted. That's in our law. If you don't like it, you can change. That's the law. So the argument for giving these people due process was that, yeah, you committed a crime, that you are subject to deportation, but not under our law if you can show that the country that you're headed for is likely to torture you, right? But you have to prove that. Okay, and most people, I think, would be sympathetic not having us become complicit in torture, sending someone to a torture chamber. But again, even those who think if you commit a really bad crime, we don't care whether you get tortured, then you have to change the law. Because the law is very clear right now. We cannot deport people to countries where they're likely to be tortured.
Well, let me ask you this, Bruce, and I think this is a really important part, and maybe I can learn in this example is, so I agree with that entirely, but I think my other point was simply that let's say hypothetically someone commits a crime, right? And they're going through all these different processes, the appeals and whatever else, and that's been going on. And then now 6 months later, this deportation case comes around, or they want to deport that person. Now, am I right in saying that then now that initiates a new process where they are required to present the evidence that they claim this person? Like, my point is that right now, if they can just go, well, he is guilty because of previous discussions, and then just deport a large swath of people, we can tell that they're making mistakes in that. They're grabbing people that are not. So in that, even if people are shown to be, let's say someone here illegally from before who's going through processes, and then a year later they try to deport them, don't they then have to present that again to make sure that person is effectively what they claim they are in that moment, despite previous engagements? Let me know if I'm wrong in that, because I think that's important.
Yeah, of course, they can initiate it. I mean, there isn't in the deportation area or immigration law something that corresponds to the criminal justice, no double jeopardy. Mm-hmm. So in criminal, you're tried for a crime, you're acquitted, that's it. They can't try you for the crime again, okay? In immigration, okay, they can try to deport you once. If they don't succeed, if they come back and they got information that's different, and under different provision of the immigration law, they can go back and start over again. I mean, that's one of the things that's so mystifying, if you will. Why do you want to fall on their sword on Abrego Garcia?
Right. It's
clear that he was subject to deportation, but the Trump judge said, well, he's likely, if we deport him to Venezuela, he's likely to subject to torture or persecution. Therefore, until a time comes we can find a safe place to deport him to, you can't remove him. Mm-hmm. Now, if the Trump people believe he's a terrorist, which is a different deportable offense than others, then if he comes back, they could initiate deportation proceedings and deport him on different grounds that they're able to deduce evidence of.
But they'd have to
it's
prove
not like he gets a get out of jail free card. That's not what happens.
But they'd have to prove that secondary claim. That's what I'm trying to say. Right.
You gotta have evidence.
Yeah.
I think that my own view of things is that the Trump people have been living in a fantasy land for so long because they're cosseted, they got all this money. They don't really understand the idea of evidence because it hasn't mattered in their own life. You can make anything up you want and you got away with it. And so now they confront courts who say, hey, there are rules on what's admissible or not, and your dream, at midnight is not evidence of anything. And that's why they're losing all of these cases, because they don't even know what real evidence is that can survive cross-examination.
If we think about, people can talk about the lawfare and the Biden administration executed and the Democrats will execute it against Trump. But let's look at the behavior we learned from these litigations, okay? What do we learn from the Stormy Daniels lawsuit? What we learned from the Stormy Daniels lawsuit was that Trump went to a friend at some publication. Trump panted those stories. They knew they were false stories. and then like the stories about Teddy Cruz and whatever. So then he goes on a debate stage and says, "I read in this newspaper, this story that's authoritarian, that should be believed because of where it was published, but he planted the story, and the story was published specifically. So he's basically perpetrating lies that he created, and using a third party to basically like laundering the story through. So he was laundering stories through these other things, these phony stories. They were prepared to help him launder these phony stories that then he used them. So clearly he was willing to lie to get to the office, right? He was saying all these stories, he was inventing them, and then using them as if the citation was some real credible third party source when he was the source. So now let's take a look at what was discovered with his financial disclosures. Okay, so clearly what happened, from the financial disclosures is, yes, when the bank first underwrote the loan, he presented a balance sheet. They did due diligence at the time. They underwrote the loan, and they said, okay, we'll lend you money, but you have to preserve certain types of collateral requirements. We need you to demonstrate certain levels of liquidity, and we need to make sure that you always have enough assets backing those loans. Because if you don't, that'll trigger something. Couple of things. We might have to come back. We might have to ask you for more collateral. We might have to banks. We might have to ask you to sell some assets, or we might accelerate maturity. Okay. So what happened? During that period of time, he probably was in breach of those covenants. So instead of going back and telling the bank, I'm in breach of the covenants, they just made up numbers. Okay. So they just made up numbers to not be in breach of the covenants, because being in breach of the covenants would have triggered an event that would have been, he might not have been able to borrow any more money. Who knows what the consequences, but I've run a bank. Okay. When people are in, one is the financial system doesn't work if every time a borrower, I had to do due diligence on every quarterly report they sent me. I'd be making almost no loans, or loans would be very expensive because the staff I would need to provide that type of. So we have a system that's based upon a concept called, hard for people to believe, okay, very difficult word, but the financial system is based on a concept called trust. Trust, okay? So what do you trust? You trust that you're telling somebody, saying, I'm giving you this money. You have to come back and report to me honestly about your financial condition. I'm going to trust that you're doing that. And if you find out that you abuse that trust, if I find you abuse that trust, then I'm gonna come after you. So, but I'm basically, if I find that I can't borrow, if I can't trust the information you're supplying me for me to be able to monitor your loan, then I just won't lend to you at all if that trust doesn't exist. But it's never going to be a system where, in the absence of trust, I got to hire now a whole bunch of bankers to validate every piece of information you're giving me. No, that's not how the system works. If we want a system like that, then basically very few people would get loans, or people would have to pay a lot more money to get loans than they're currently paying for it, under more onerous contracts. So that would be the concept. It would be a social loss. The financial system would be much less efficient, to the detriment of our total economy. So that just reinforces the fact is that this guy will lie about anything and everything. Okay. So what do you think the instructions he's giving his team, okay, on what he expects them to do, is to be as shameless a liar, as he is on these issues. So this is when we get to these points of these people making, just these absurd arguments where they're abusing the courts, and some of the courts are acknowledging how much their statements are, and they're losing credibility, in the courts, because they're prepared to say anything. So now going back to this issue of case, the question is, did they make a mistake, or the point of time they didn't even give a shit, okay, and they just did it anyway, but they were caught, okay? Mm-hmm. And so, is this really an administration that's completely lawless? and then ignore the courts or diminish the courts when the courts come back and catch them in their errors. So are these really people making mistakes, or these people acting in this way because they think this is what Trump wants? They want to make him happy, and at the end of the day, if they do the wrong thing, they'll get pardoned by him, and so there'll be no consequences that they can behave, with immunity and impunity. So I think that's that. So I think they just don't care about doing what's right because there's no consequence. There's only reward for doing wrong. There's no adverse cost associated with being wrong. So is Trump going to call up Haba and Haba and say you're really screwed up for this, or did the instructions of how to handle the situation in Newark come from somebody at the White House? And maybe Trump didn't know, but maybe whoever gave the instructions because they thought that's what Trump would want them to do. So,
and I think, and there are consequences, I think, Jeffrey, that's shown that if you do the right thing, you get punished. I mean, that was, and the lawyer who was conceding that there was error in having Abrego Garcia deported, they immediately removed him. You're fired, right? Because he said he actually told the judge the truth. So they know exactly that if you're a truth teller, you're got no shelf life in the White House. And a couple of other points that I think support what your observations have been, Jeffrey. Remember, Trump, he says, this is during the first term, just at the time when he's leaving and he's trying to get some momentum behind challenging the outcome of the 2020 election. He calls over to the Justice Department and says, just announce that you're undertaking an investigation into fraud. It doesn't have to be true, right? He says, I'll take care of the PR. Says he wants them to just lie, make it up that there's an investigation when there even isn't. Right. And that's the same modus operandi he used with Zelensky in this famous or infamous telephone call. You just need to announce that you're investigating Joe Biden or Hunter. It doesn't need to be true. I'll take care of the PR. I mean, this is how this guy's mind works. And that's why when they were contemplating having Mr. Trump testify in the so-called Mueller investigation, his own lawyer, John Dowd, was quoted as saying there's no way that he would ever let his client testify. He would be incapable of not committing perjury. So he says he never, ever would permit that. So we're dealing with this kind of gentleman in the White House and need to react accordingly.
If you read his books, it's very, very clear about not just that that's the case, but the very clear promotion of that being, from a business perspective, at the very least, something that everyone should lean into. The cutthroat manipulation, lie where you need to, double cross whoever you need to. And I'm just, outlining the way I read what he's describing. But if you read it, it's very clear. I mean, it's, but again, from a business perspective, that is seemingly coveted today, like that kind of cutthroat mentality. But we're dealing with quite a bit different story here, and that's why it becomes, just unnerving to see how clear that is and how really, for me, how many people out there are beginning to adopt that as the way we need to go forward. Kind of this rampant lawlessness that, might makes right, rather, is the way it really gets seen, and that's a worldview that scares me.
The example I think I shared with you the other day in the group was now this Bannon's comments about what should happen to Lindsey Graham. Yeah. He should not be allowed in the country, and if he could, he's a traitor and should be imprisoned. What? Because he's inciting people to have a different position than what Bannon's position is on our role with respect to Ukraine. That he might convince people that we should continue to support Ukraine. The point of this is not for me to take a position on whether we should support Ukraine or not, but that's really Bannon's position. Bannon's position is he went there, Ukraine had a very successful operation against the Russians, very successful, and Graham is there, and between the success of that operation, he's worried that Graham will come back and there'll be more credibility to say, look, this guy can really do damage to the Russians, and and we got to keep supporting him. So basically, to prevent him from having that argument that people might accept, that's the threat to Bannon, is that he might come back and successfully convince people that we should continue to support Ukraine. So the remedy is that this senator, should not be allowed back into the country for a position they have on public policy, that they should be. This is the and you think when Bannon says this to his audience in War Room, You don't think that he knows he's got millions of people saying, I agree with you, I agree with you, I agree with you. That's why he's saying it. He's saying it because he knows people are shaking their heads and say, yes, kick him out, kill him. He's a traitor. If he comes back, hang him. Okay. This is the mentality. How sick is that of a mentality? All the guy is expressing his point of view. He's expressing his opinion. This is from the party that says we don't like cancel culture. This is the ridiculed people for being snowflakes. They're snowflakes. Okay.
Well, so what's important to add, though, and I agree, but the last part you said there about just the idea of somebody, regardless of his intention, because I'm very much of the mind that he is he's been stoking this proxy war well before 2016. So him being there, I agree, is not in good intention. Nonetheless, he's out there speaking about his position as a member of Congress. The idea that Bannon could say, remove his passport at the very least, like it just shows you this kind of authoritarian, dictatorial kind of these people want absolute control as long as they get what they want out of it. You know what I mean?
I think it's worse than that. I think it's worse than that. These people despise the idea of thinking, intellect. That's why they never want to engage on the merits. Instead of listening to Lindsey Graham, I don't agree with him, and say, Lindsey, this is where I think you're misplaced. This is how civilization works. Let's engage and argue. This is why I think you're wrong-headed. No, they just want to pick up a bludgeon and smash his head in because they don't really believe in communication. All it is power. If I have the power, I don't need to argue. I just coerce you. And that is certainly the end of any kind of republic whatsoever. But I agree. This guy is fanatic. And what is terrifying is he's not isolated.
Yeah.
As Jeffrey's pointing out, look at all these listeners on his program. Are you kidding me?
He's tapped into Trump's administration. We're going to be honest.
If somebody refuses to engage on the merits and argue with you, they shouldn't be part of the United States morally. That's what civilization is about, engaging views. You get it right or wrong. You don't coerce people. You then ultimately try to persuade by the argument. That's what raises us above animals. And they want to go back into an animal view. Okay, if I got the power to do it, then I don't need to listen to you. Right. And I say that's the end of intellect. We're going to be back into the dark ages. Even worse than the dark ages. Before writing, we won't even have hieroglyphics.
Yeah, and going back to the the arguments that Bruce has made, and also I think for the potential for the future, that is not, if you think about how constitutional design, it's not one level of checks and balances, it's multiple levels of checks and balances. So it was designed as a decentralized system that has become centralized, and that's the threat of all this data. Is the enemy is a centralization of power. Okay,
right.
So the Constitution tried to have a checks and balances not just on a federal level, but it's not just the federal government checking itself. It's the state government checking the federal government, and the federal government checking the state government, and the local government checking the state government, and the state government checking the local government. So there was redundancy in systems of checks and balances. And the whole point of the redundancy of checks and balances was to avoid tyranny, was to avoid despotism, was to avoid the concentration and centralization of power. Okay. That's what the design was that's part of the design of the Constitution, was to avoid the centralization of power. That's why even Madison defined tyranny as having one party control all branches of government. That Madison defined that as a state of tyranny. So they hated tyranny. They hated despotism. They loved liberty. So for me, the way I like to express it is that the world was populated by sovereign nations where some sovereign ruled subjects, okay? And the people under their domain, under their dominion, under their jurisdiction was subjects, okay? The concept of a subject is antithetical to we're not subjects, okay? We're sovereign individuals, okay? So this was the first modern constitution that acknowledged the individual as sovereign, and that the government had limitations to preserve its legitimacy of claims it could make against a sovereign individual. And their sovereign individual came from the natural rights that everybody's endowed with the moment that they're born. And that was the uniqueness in terms of modern times of government. That's the unique concept. And that's been completely lost.
Yeah,
Okay?
and you know, it's highlighted the first three words of our Constitution: "We, the people of the United States," not the government, not a tyrant. We, the people, we're the one who are ordaining the Constitution.
Right.
It comes from us, not from some higher authority. And that's the whole idea of the Declaration of Independence as well, with these unalienable rights. And indeed, it says in the Declaration, the purpose of government is what? To secure the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, not to create a tyranny, not to create an empire or anything like that. And it goes on to say that when a government becomes destructive of securing those rights, there is a right of the people to change the form of government, to establish new institutions that will safeguard those rights.
Or abolish
what
it.
is more simple than that?
Or
That the
abolish it.
people are governing, and now we haven't turned it on its head, you know? Everything comes from the government. They have an automatic legitimacy because they're sitting in the White House. No, the legitimacy always goes back to we, the people of the United States. But I say, you know, power is not self-executing. Even though it came up with this very exciting, I call really electrifying concept that we get to govern ourselves, if we don't stand up and insist on it, I can guarantee you the rulers will try to capture and steal it all away from us, because they naturally love and crave power, because they're sociopaths in general who race to acquire a political position. And if we aren't alert and vigilant to protect and secure these rights and capture them back from government, we're going to lose them. And we wouldn't be the first ones to do it. 7 prior empires, the same thing. The Roman Senate turned into nothing but an instrument to deify emperors, you know, when they decided to give up their authority.
So I think it's important to add to that.
Debase money, and then I debase people's rights, and then I have anarchy and then implosion. I mean, that's
the other aspect of what Bruce said there is to alter or abolish it. And I think it'd be interesting for us to eventually have a conversation about, I think Jeffrey and I are on the same page in regard to the world possible future of no government at all. I think that's something we should not box out of the conversation. I definitely would agree that we're way far away from that right now with the way we are. People are so embedded in this idea. Like, the main problem, or one of today, is that they've been convinced that government gave them those rights, as opposed to understanding the inherent nature of them. But I just think that's interesting to think about, that they included that, that should it, what is it, to its own, what is it? How does it go? If it's destructive to its own ends, right? Alter or abolish it. And I just love that idea, because, think about how crazy it is that if you actually bring this up in any real context, that we should abolish the government, you're a terrorist in the world today. And the guy in the government, even though it's in our Constitution, I just think that explains itself,
Yeah, it does. And I think the reason why we ended up, I believe, as embracing as our founding documents, I call it our birth certificate, these were the most libertarian documents in the history of the world, in part was because the intellectual leaders were at the short stick of power. We're the ones getting screwed over by King George III and the parliament and whatever. So we saw life, the intellectual leaders, from the side of the governed, not the governors, right? So now we have a group of people who've been in government their whole lives. And Joe Biden is a perfect example. Yeah, but even if not, they are political people. They've been and they see power not from the viewpoint of those who are being governed, but the ones who are governors say, well, who cares? We're not going to be subject to these laws. We got enough power to escape them. We got enough money to escape them. These other people will be, and that's why they continue to build these huge empires and massive government programs, surveillance and otherwise, because they figure they're not the ones who are going to be at the short end of the stick here. And their issue and their mindset is not a liberty mindset. Their mindset is a power mindset, because they're occupying the organs of power, unlike our framers, who were not occupying the organs of power. They were the resistance. And that's why they could appreciate liberty more than what our officials can today.
Yeah, Bruce, I think earlier you mentioned that maybe one of the wisest of the Supreme Court justices was Louis Brandeis.
Yeah.
And, one is Louis Brandeis probably wrote the best opinions with respect to privacy, the expectations of privacy. And Louis Brandeis also said maybe the most important right of every individual is the right to be left alone.
Let alone he said the most cherished right among civilized people is the right to be let alone.
And we're proving we're not civilized people.
Yeah, it's right. And the other thing, if you read that opinion, it's a dissent in Homestead versus United States. He's very prescient. This is a time when just doing the wiretapping that was introduced to try to fight prohibition. Anyway, he says there are going to be ways to intrude on privacy that we can't possibly foresee. They're going to be ways, because the decision was an absurd decision by the Chief Justice Taft, who said, well, if you read the language of the Fourth Amendment, it doesn't use the word a conversation. And a wiretap just intercepts a conversation. And therefore, even though it's an invasion of privacy, since the Fourth Amendment doesn't say conversation, it doesn't cover this. And Brandeis says, well, wait, we're going to get technologies that intercept and invade privacy in all sorts of ways no one could have foreseen at the time of the Fourth Amendment ratification. We have to interpret the Fourth Amendment to its purpose. It's like St. Paul. The spirit liveth, and the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. And so he foresaw exactly what was going to happen, and he did. But unfortunately, he dissent, and we ignored what his warning was. We keep going around with this stupid argument that unless the framers could have anticipated AI, it's not governed by the Fourth Amendment, even though it's the greatest intrusion on privacy in the history of the world.
It's the same with the Second Amendment. The very clear language gets contorted into somehow being for hunting. It's like we could have never foreseen the types of munition. And that's why I'll always argue that these are timeless arguments, right? That they apply based on principle. And that's it, and it's so frustrating that we have to argue. And in my opinion, and you probably agree, with people that aren't just confused, that are just deliberately misrepresenting these things for positions of power,
Yeah. And I think that they are so intoxicated with power. They don't even, I don't think their brains actually distinguish between this is truth and this is falsity. Their brains only distinguish this helps me and this hurts me. And whatever helps them is true for that day and time, and what hurts them is false. But it could be the opposite the next 24 hours. They don't care.
It seems to me the Second Amendment, from my reading and interpretation of it, and what I think is the public meaning at the time it was worded, is the fact is that they didn't want us to be in a state of tyranny, and a way to have tyranny is to have a standing army, and the way to avoid to have a standing army was to have regulated state militias. Right. Because one is we didn't want a national army. We wanted, because the states didn't want to have the concerns about that they could be dominated by a standing national army. Right. So the whole point of this is each states would have their own regulated militia, and in many states there were laws that required people to actually buy muskets and have ammunition unless there were certain people in certain professions who were exempt from that requirement. So that was basically, maybe Bruce has a different interpretation, but for me, it's as simple as, again, that's I want to avoid tyranny. So I don't want the federal government being the arms only held by a national army that reported to the president. No, we don't want to have that type of, lack of balance and power. We always want the system of checks and balances, and the way we check the balances is the fact that there's a threat to all the 13 colonies that now created a nation, is that everyone would have their state militias and act with the same enthusiasm of protecting, their homeland, and everybody would be armed, and the governors of each state, would have, the responsibility of controlling their state militias, and that was not. It was not, and of course, yes, people went out hunting and they used the gun because they hunted to feed themselves and stuff like that. But the purpose was so to avoid that there would be a standing army, and there'd be state militias instead of a standing army.
Yeah, so but the complementary to that, Jeffrey, because they wouldn't dispute that understanding of the Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. See, the framers understood, especially Madison, that if you have Congress is given the lead powers over the armed forces in Article 1. If you have Congress, because you don't have an empire dictating the status of the armed forces, you're not going to have a standing army. We never had a standing army at the beginning for like 100 years, because Congress was the one who was making the decisions. They weren't creating standing armies. This Mexican-American War, we didn't have standing armies. And that was, and as Jeffrey was pointing out, we have multiple checks on pure stupid majoritarian rule. And this was another one. Congress is by nature a talking shop. It gets nothing out of warfare, right? Because all the power and the heroism goes to the president. So if you entrust the actual decision over the state of the armed forces of the Congress, you're not going to get standing armies. That reinforces, the idea that the Second Amendment would fill the gap because Congress is not going to create standing armies. The reason why we ended up with standing armies because Congress went AWOL. Said, okay, President, you do whatever you want. And it took 100-some years. Again, it all goes back to the symptom that we chose, and I believe for Faustian bargain, we decided, hey, we'd rather be an empire than celebrate liberty. And the only way we can be an empire, let's just keep all the power in the White House and the Congress is nothing. And we can just imitate the Romans and David in the Old Testament and create a kingdom. I don't believe that. I don't think a country's great because they're an empire. I think they're great because they celebrate and honor liberty, because they give dignity to everybody who's a citizen.
Right.
That's what makes a country great. And this stupid idea that what makes a country great is how many square miles it controls and what the GNP is and whether you have people on health insurance or, how far we can project, our power abroad. That's absurd. That makes no sense at all. It's how we treat individuals with dignity, due process, and giving everybody a chance to march to their own drummer. And that is the summit of greatness. Unfortunately, it's not been a majority in the history of the world. All these other countries know our greatness is how far we can march abroad and destroy other people and countries. We need to get out of that. I mean, we thought we did with the Declaration of Independence, and we did for 100 and some years until we decided around the time of 1900 and Spanish-American War, hey, let's be an empire. Let's go to tell the Filipinos how they ought to live. Puerto Rico, Guam, every place. We're now the chosen people, and only people who deserve self-determination is us, white Anglo-Saxon men. That's the only people. These other people in Asia, they don't get any of those rights. And we've been a downward trajectory ever since that time.
And a good one of many examples of how Congress, I think, was manipulated to I guess, forego its or ignore its responsibility is through lobbying, is through, just money in politics and all sorts of other ways where they are basically, or the fact that they're able to invest in companies that they could legislate around, like that ultimately they're financially invested in what you highlighted, the war or anything else going on, to where now they do have an interest in and they're not just talking about policy, and they're now invested in the machine. And that's part of that larger problem. Money in politics is one of a million things that we need to change, but I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, when we even would learn a lesson, we went into Afghanistan. What we proved is we can kill a lot of people, but we lost the war. Okay. So we went into Iraq, we killed a lot of people, but we lost the war.
I guess it depends on what you think your objective was.
Vietnam, we killed a lot of people and a lot of us were killed, but we lost the war. Okay. We went into Korea, we killed a lot of people, but we lost the war. Okay. So, and now we see an example of what was the cost to Russia of what's the replacement cost of Russia for what they lost in the drone strike, and how much do you think it cost the Ukrainians to build those drones that inflicted that type of damage? What we know is probably the cost of those drones were a small percentage of the cost of the Russians of replacing that very expensive aircraft. So technology, we innovate in technology, all the time. So we invest a significant amount of dollars, and then people innovate with ways of rendering these weapons. Yes. So what we can do is we want to go out and drop nuclear weapons all over the world. Yes, we can annihilate countries and basically, if we want to do that, we could do that. But if we're not prepared to use nuclear weapons or just to annihilate countries, with also the threat that other countries would then do the same thing, as we did, we find these conventional measures of all this equipment that we've invested in, okay, doesn't help us win wars, okay? It doesn't. So what are we spending the money on? We're not winning any wars. We're not making our country any safer. So this is a very, it's ironic of all the time that, again, going back to where we started the conversation, Bruce, with Doggy and Elon Musk, okay, probably the area of the greatest waste in the government budget is the military, and they didn't even touch the military, or they found no waste, fraud, abuse in the military. So we have $1 trillion budget where there's maybe a $3 or $4 of waste, fraud, and abuse in the total military budget, when probably very little of it actually is efficient and effective at keeping us a safe and secure country.
One thing to add, though, is I think it's important to consider, I don't disagree with you, but whether that's actually their objective, or whether there's multifaceted objectives for different factions of, where this country has gone. Because I agree in a lot of senses, at least some of those wars you highlighted, the objective was, not fulfilled. But I think some of them were about chaos and just destabilization. And like going back to people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, like the balkanization of the Middle East, like these are long-term plans of just destabilizing and chopping up areas for different control functions, So it's interesting to wonder whether, even just from an internal perspective, that was the case, or outside influence as well,
Yeah,
but I don't
the
disagree with your
framers,
point.
but I think, Ryan, the framers would have said, why are we involved at all?
Yeah.
We have invincible self-defense. We don't celebrate misery abroad, but why are we even there?
Yes.
Why do we care? As long as we have invincible self-defense, we should engage with everybody else in a peaceful fashion. Don't touch us, we'll incinerate you. And I can't avoid repeating. It's not because we like other people to be tyrannized. It's because we know we only can bring a cure worse than the disease. Taliban now in Afghanistan is worse than we entered, right?
Right.
Libya today is a complete chaos. It was worse now than under Gaddafi. Not only do we know that we make cures worse than the disease because we're not omniscient, we then destroy our own liberty at home, because it's the nature of projecting military power that all power gets concentrated in the executive, and it goes from transparency to secrecy, you borrow money, whatever. It happens, you can't escape that.
Right.
So the reason why we take this viewpoint of invincible self-defense, it's the optimal, not the perfect, the optimal way to secure liberty and keep our own safety at home and the best we can abroad by example. That's it. Yeah. It doesn't help things to have a very, as Blandai said, have a very benevolent intent, but then you end up making it worse than you thought because you overestimated how much you knew.
Yeah, I think from what I understand, Ryan, and I don't like speaking for other people. So Ryan, if I misstate what I think I understand you're stating, and please correct me, but I think what you're saying is that the goal is not a benign goal. The goal is to create chaos, and then through the act of create chaos, it's through this divide and conquer, and we can instill fear in the American public, so we can control the American public by creating chaos all over the world. And so is that part of the point you're trying to make?
Yeah, well, to a degree. I mean, again, and I'm with you. I think all of these things are happening. Like, I think that there's different agendas and different factions trying to accomplish different things. And, these are easy to lay out, and what's really the driving factor of the day is hard to tell. But I think that what you can see is like both at home and abroad. So I'm glad you said the American people, because I do think that's happening here as well. But like taking an example of something like Afghanistan, clearly from administration to administration, the objectives in the immediacy changed. And you can see, and maybe this wasn't the original objective, maybe it never was, but around all of the chaos, there was, they said that we're defraying the cost of assistance by mining everything, the lithium out of the mountains, or the opium fields, or any number of different things that happened. And every war has those. And so you just wonder whether in some level, maybe from a corporate level, maybe a lobbyist level, that they see an opportunity. And I hate even a dark angle, like Syria and human trafficking and organ trafficking exploded during that time frame in the area, the surrounding areas. So people just flock to these things. And I think whether it's the design or not, they're allowed to fester and continue because the black market thrives in these areas, And I think the problem is that it's become, like, as Bruce was highlighting, like really overlapped and immersed with the people in power in this country, where they're no longer interested in liberty or the best interest of the American people. That's what they profess, but they see the profit motive or the profit interest in any of the things they're doing in the chaos, in that, keeping, like they know in a, despotic or even just more of an authoritarian regime, there's a lot more opportunity for them to take advantage in 1,000 different ways. And so if their interest is liberty, like Bruce was saying, well, then we drive in a certain direction, but I don't think that's their interest, to make that really broad. But I do think the main point is, in some people's minds, destabilization causes the opportunity for a lot of different things.
Yeah. Like I think from I think when Bush became president, one is I think the what was the I forget his name now, Secretary of Defense
Rumsfeld, Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah, Rumsfeld had talked about he was going to investigate the $1 trillion, various trillions of dollars of funds, of monies that there was unaccounted for, and apparently all the records of that was in one of the World Trade Center building, and that is the World Trade Center building that imploded or collapsed, and apparently is not a good explanation on why.
Without being hit, by the way, without being hit by a plane.
Without being hit by a plane that collapsed, and then it seems that the Patriot Act was actually written prior to September 11th. So, obviously that would make you wonder when you look at those facts of saying is you're going to investigate the abuse. So you have a Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, who was somebody who would be good at detecting and discovering, this type of stuff, this type of fraud, was going to supposedly investigate it. And then suddenly this building goes down that was never hit. And there's never been an explanation really, from the engineers that went in to try to explain how it really happened. So there seems to be a dispute among experts about how that happened. And that just happened to be the building where all the records were, to been able to perform the audit. And then the next day out comes this Patriot Act. If you look at that fact pattern, you sit back and say something suspicious here. So that makes you then question is what did we know? When did we know it?
See, Jeffrey, I don't think anything is so-called suspicious, at least in the sense that unexpected. That's how government operates. That's why you need checks and balances. We know this is going to go on without checks and balances and transparency. All people do this. They're sociopaths that are there. I don't trust the government to say or do anything. I mean, you give one example, another one. DePaul O'Neill, who was Secretary of Treasury in the first W administration, says the very, very first cabinet meeting, they're already talking about invading Iraq. Here's our chance. Let's invade Iraq. Get rid of Saddam. He's a bad guy. Right? This is even before 9/11. They already decided, okay, they knew what they wanted to. So anything building up to giving some excuse to invade Iraq, it was already set. It didn't even matter. Without 9/11 just gave an excuse to go in, try to get rid of him. And think of how stupid that is.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein was our cost-free check against hegemonic Iran with the mullahs, right? Cost us nothing. The two hated each other. We get rid of Iraq. At present, Iraq is a satellite, wholly owned satellite of Iran. We made it. We made Iran strong in the Middle East by destroying Iraq as any kind of independent sovereign. Has anybody paid a price? Who are these geniuses who recommended that? No one pays a price for this stupidity. No one pays a price for 2.3 trillion lost in Afghanistan. It just keeps going on and on and on. And you talk about this is a merit-based system? Really? Stupidity after stupidity. It's because the empire can't afford to say we made a mistake, maybe we should downsize, because there's so much money and power involved in the industrial complex. Everybody's getting some monetary or other reward by keeping the empire intact. So there's no oversight. No one ever gets criticized for the stupidity. Day after day, stupidity after stupidity comes to nothing. Think, if you go back and think, since Korea, take the last 75 years, has anybody in the military establishment ever suffered some kind of sanctioned demotion, including the intelligence establishment or a president, for making these stupid decisions? Did anybody in the CIA get demoted when they said the Chinese will not enter the Korean War? And they did 3 million. Nothing happens.
Right.
Wait a minute. We're supposed to be merit-based. If you make, this would be like putting somebody who bats, 100, on the all-star team.
Right.
Wait a minute. You think you're going to win games if you have a 100 batter and you're putting in as the cleanup hitter? And then no one would do that. But in the military industrial complex, no matter how bad and stupid you are, you never, ever get demoted. There's no risk for doing really dumb things. And that's why it repeats itself over and over again.
I always use the example.
Go ahead.
Okay, I always use the example of the foreign policy, just in general point, where what's the argument every time? We're whatever regime. What's the word they use today? Regime change, invading. Yeah. We're gonna go into the country for freedom, right? We're gonna save the country, and Iraq, they're gonna praise us as liberators. Okay, clearly that didn't happen. Destroyed the country. Over and over every single time we're gonna save them, and then well, look at Libya. You could argue Libya doesn't even exist anymore. And so it's like how many times in a row can they claim we're gonna save them and then they destroy the country before we go? Either either they're bad at this, that we shouldn't let them keep doing it, or they're not trying to save these countries. They're batting zero. It's like, but we keep letting it happen because, the point is, I don't think they really mean what they're saying. And we should question, as you're saying, Bruce, like the intentions. We're back a long way about what they say about any of these countries. They lie about a lot of stuff.
Sometimes I argue with people on a couple of points. One is, we spend, if you take the next 10, 11 countries combined on their military spending, combined, they don't spend as much money as we spend.
That's so wild.
So we spend, if you take Russia and China combined, we spend more than twice what they spend annually than they spend. So the argument I make with people is to think about this. We're saying China in and of itself represents a militarily existential threat to us, spending 1/3 what we spend. So if we're that stupid spending money, if we have to spend 3 times the money and we're spending it 3 times, we're spending it less productively and less efficiently than China or Russia, why should we give these people who have proven to be so stupid in spending money, why should we give them more money? Okay. So I've never had anybody give me an answer to that. But somehow a country can spend 20%, a country can have 15% of our GDP, spend 15% on their military that we spend, and they can represent an existential threat to us. And then we're spending this difference compounded annually, how much more money we spend compounded annually over this period of time. And with all that money we spend, these countries still represent an existential threat to us. How moronic are the people who we're giving the money to in how they're spending money, that they can't use the money effectively to counter people who are spending significantly less than us? And why do we want to give them more money? What public company would you go to that says, look at my history of failures, and I'm going to raise capital, and here's my track record, and you're going to allocate capital to somebody with that track record? Nobody. This is why people won't pay taxes to support this stuff, and we got to go into debt because people know whatever the government does, it sucks at. Okay?
Yeah. So, and it's not only, but the idea of existential threat is such a joke. The fact is, we got 800 military bases abroad. We got all these fleets right off the South China Sea. China doesn't have any, maybe has 1 or 2 bases, in Djibouti or maybe someplace in Venezuela. Who knows? And suddenly they're an existential threat to us. We're the existential threat to them. They look around and said 800 military bases, hundreds of thousand troops in foreign countries, and contesting, China's sovereignty, if you will, over the South China Sea. Say that's what makes it so absurd, and why the government has to. And it's amazing, how glib and how indulgent, we are, because we believe we're an empire. We think that since we're an empire, we're the only country in the world that gets to have spheres of influence. No, that's God-given sphere of influence. No other country should be able to act like us. Why is that? Well, because we got nukes. That's the answer. We got it, and you don't. And then as long as we can get away with it, we can do it. But that's not what that's not what the Constitution of the United States was born to accomplish. Have that attitude. We basically turned into the carbon copy of the same arrogance of King George III that we thought we got rid of in 1776.
Exactly.
I want to raise one more point, and then I'll let you all each raise one more point. We'll call this conversation over. But which is I always enjoy thoroughly. So I hate when they end. So it's so enjoyable. But another story that I think I shared, was a story about how that I read from the Gateway Pundit, talking about the persecution of Navarro because he did not comply with a government subpoena, with a congressional subpoena, and hand over documents. And basically, he was using Proton emails. And then going back to, a judge both you and I admire, Bruce, and Louis Brandeis, who said sunlight is the best disinfectant. Basically what they're celebrating is a government that will use private and personal communication channels in order to make sure that they're not subject to congressional oversight or the public's oversight through freedom of information requests. So basically what they're celebrating is a completely opaque government where people from the executive branch can communicate with each other, and that nobody would have any access to any of those communications. So think about how perverse it is, because that's what they're celebrating. They're celebrating.
It just depends.
They would not celebrate Joe Biden doing that.
No, or Hillary Clinton. Hillary
Right.
Clinton's emails, private emails. That was the source of Mount Vesuvius eruptions. But now when they do it, it's okay.
And both matter, right? That's
Yeah,
the point.
yeah.
They both,
They both. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
both. It's just hypocrisy is limitless.
Right. Well, to add to that, Jeffrey, since can keep it in one thought, because I think this is interesting. One thing that I've called out right when before we even got into after the selection, the election process, the interesting overlap of the ethics pledges and the lack thereof from this administration. It's not actually a completely new point. There was an overlap of this there's different examples of it, but in the recent Trump administration, there's a law that was put into reality in Trump's first administration that Biden complied with. It was like an ethics overlap. I forget the nuance of it, but that he ignored in this recent one. Now, the reason I'm laying this out is that I think Bondi, Hegseth, and a couple of others, there's examples that are, and I'm correct, forgive me if I'm naming the wrong ones, but there's at least a few of them that did not go through the ethics pledges process. And I think Trump was one of them. And I think the problem that I had with that is the lack of transparency around a lot of different things. And I think what's interesting is that was one of the other parts that happened was when they transitioned, they decided not to use the government buildings. They didn't use the government servers and all this different stuff. And I thought that was such an interesting standout point for obvious reasons. But now with what you're saying, it just becomes more, is that because there's a lot more happening, whether it's AI government or technocracy or whatever it is, to where they don't want to be able to be seen with the process. And now with the Elon part and how they're kind of pulling apart, and whether that's real or not, I can't tell. I just think it's an interesting picture to see that, we've never been in a position where we see less about the most transparent administration in history, like what they call themselves. And I just think that's a really conspicuous thing to see, because they're building out a control, as Catherine would call it, the digital control structure. They're building that. And I think
it speaks volumes that Musk was outraged when it suggested that, and the court held that the Freedom of Information Act does apply to DOGE, to act as a government agency. Really, why do you have a problem with that? But I sound like a broken record. It all goes back to Congress. Congress was expected to ensure that the government was transparent through oversight, through hearings. So you can actually, in fact, Woodrow Wilson once wrote that the informing function, the investigative function of Congress is maybe more important than its legislative function. That's the reason why you have oversight, hearings, and people have to testify under oath. That doesn't even exist anymore. I mean, the idea of an actual hearing on an appropriations bill, it's all decided. Maybe the leadership of the House and Senate goes over to the White House, cuts a deal, comes back. Here's 3,000 pages. You voted up or down, without any debate. It's ridiculous. And that's why, again, strengthening Congress is so critical here. Again, it's not because they're all going to be saints. It's because the institutional incentives and checks and oversights will work to our advantage, because it'll force things above ground. And secrecy, as Brandeis said, sunshine is the best disinfectant, against all this stupidity. But it's just truly amazing, because Congress, they just don't hold hearings anymore. Like they shut down, or the hearings that they held, it's over whether we should have daylight savings time. Right?
They're all making too much money, I think.
Just as one example, then I think we should go. During the 20 years of war in Afghanistan, spending $2.3 trillion, there was never any one Fulbright oversight hearing. What in the heck are we going to do? Wow. Not one. Zero. The only hearing they ever had was after Biden pulled out. They got some of the stumbles that were made in the pullout. But the 20 years and 2.3 trillion, off limits from investigation. It's stunning.
Wow.
I have a question. I have an exit question for you, Bruce.
Yeah.
Given what we've seen of the Trump administration, which doesn't surprise me, many people seem like they're surprised, but I'm not surprised. You clearly have a Congress whose oversight function is an oversight function against previous administrations, not the current administration. Right? They're not providing any oversight over Trump. They're providing oversight over things done by Biden. But they're not providing oversight over the existing administration. So they're providing no oversight over that. Given the fact that that's behavior, given the fact that the Trump administration is basically talked about pursuing people like the guy who wrote the anonymous story, Miles Taylor, his name. Given the fact that you have this person who's there to either convict or shame people, if someone had reasonably good foresight in what Trump's behavior would be, I'm not saying whether you agree with it, but would you really find it unreasonable, the pardons, the preemptive pardons that Biden gave at the end of his administration towards, some members that he thought might be subject to persecution? Again, I'm not saying you have to necessarily agree with the pardon, but is there a rational basis for understanding and defending that it might not have been an unreasonable thing to do, given what you're seeing of the behavior of the Trump administration so far?
Well, I think, I think I could agree partially, but not because of your sentiment is misplaced. It's that if you have a lawless government, and remember, pardons can only pardon actions before the pardon was issued.
Right. I'm glad you said that.
Things in the future.
Right.
They aren't going to have any difficulty making up. Okay, the pardon only covered up till January 20th of 2025. Now you're a terrorist. You did X, Y, Z. And of course, they don't need any evidence. So it really is a weak protection against these kinds of abuses that we've described today, including we're going to shame you even if there's no criminality. But they could make up criminality too. As far as they're concerned, you don't have to prove anything with evidence. You just claim that you're a terrorist or you're a spy for the Communist Party or something like that and go after you. Maybe it makes it a little more difficult to make up a crime, after January 20th, 2025. But if they're bent on it, the pardon's not going to be
So then let me ask one follow-up question. Is part of the big deal, and I know this is pure speculation, of the auto pen, which are legal, okay?
Right.
So Trump has used auto pen in his first term. I don't know if he used the second. Well, now he's making a big celebration of every signature, but in the past he's used auto pens, and auto pens are legal. Do you think part of the effort to investigate the auto pens is to specifically have saying is that these pardons were not legally conveyed and therefore the pardons don't exist, so the Trump administration could go after these people that maybe they want to they want to go after, and they would like to have this whatever immunity they were granted for that period of time, that they want to be able to go. Maybe they want to go after the attorney general. So maybe they want to go after some people, and that this is the way of being able to remove the benefit that they have from the pardon, so they can go after them. Do you think it's your speculation that's any of the motivating factors for making?
I think it's remote for this reason, because Trump hinted at this, after he entered office, and that is Trump wants to do the same thing Biden did when he leaves. So he doesn't want to really disturb that precedent. He cares more about protecting him and his own people than going after the people Biden did. And so that's why I think it's going to stay below the surface. Anyway, I think that is going to happen. Now, there is, however, on the books, this is a 1974 Office of Legal Counsel opinion that says a president cannot pardon himself because you have a conflict of interest. But I don't expect this president would comply with that. But that's what I think we're going to see on the last day of the Trump administration.
Well, I'll add one thing to that real quick, is I think that on top of that, I see where you're going with that, Jeff. I think Fauci stands out in the minds of his base about somebody they at least want to frame as trying to go after. But what I think is interesting is, whether or not it's more about trying to create, because as far as I know, that there's no real evidence that in any way that they can prove that it was anybody but Biden using it. That's the insinuation, which would matter if they could, but I don't see the evidence. And so all they do is go, he's senile, therefore we know that time frame must have been somebody else. That's not going to hold up. But I think it's about trying to create this sentiment that everything he was involved in is somehow not valid. Therefore, for example, all the people that he gave, amnesty to that they just sent away as illegal aliens, that's illegal, right? But they're claiming it was illegal because Biden was illegitimate. I think that's where it's going, and not just immigration, but a larger way. But I agree with everything else was said as well. I think it's a broad conversation, but it's alarming to see where it goes.
I think that's very interesting what you said, Ryan, and I think I would agree with that. Any Bruce, Ryan, any last words before we say goodbye?
My always last words are to all those who are coming aboard. We certainly compliment you for engaging. Again, we believe you're all Americans. If you're here, you're engaged, and we're not trying to inculcate any particular propaganda, but just the idea of process. And we need to all be Americans. We need to go back to the roots. We need to celebrate liberty, the dignity of the individual. And that's the starting point from getting out of this staggering mess we're in.
Here, here.
Well, and my last word is just thank you both very much. Bye.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
See you next time, guys.
Bye-bye.